The fog rolled in on Highway 101, and it never let them leave. Something climbed a fire tower in the Cascades at 3 a.m., and the ranger had nowhere to run. A tide pool on the Washington coast contained something that shouldn't exist, and it started moving toward land. Tonight on Verified Fears, we're taking you to 11 locations across the Pacific Northwest where people encountered things that defy explanation. These forests are older than human memory. These coastlines hide more than shipwrecks. And these mountains have watched countless people disappear into their depths without a trace. What stalks the clear cuts after the loggers go home? What answers when you hear your own voice calling from the darkness? What sleeps at the bottom of Crater Lake? And what happens when it wakes? The rain is falling. The mist is rising. And you're about to discover why the most isolated corner of America has become a hunting ground for nightmares. Let's begin. I was making the drive back to Portland at 11:47 p.m. when the fog rolled in. Not the usual Pacific Northwest mist that drifts across Highway 101 like a living thing, but something thicker. Something that swallowed my headlights whole and turned the world into a wall of gray 3 feet from my windshield. I'd driven this stretch between Cannon Beach and Astoria 100 times, knew every curve and straightaway like the back of my hand. But within 5 minutes of that fog settling in, I couldn't see the yellow center line anymore. I slowed to 30 miles per hour, then 20, my hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. The radio had gone to static somewhere back near Haystack Rock, and now there was nothing but the sound of my engine and my own breathing filling the car. I should have pulled over. That's what you're supposed to do when visibility drops to nothing. Find a turnout and wait it out. But I'd already passed the last scenic viewpoint miles back, and there was nothing but steep embankment on my right and a sheer drop to the ocean on my left. So I kept crawling forward, watching for taillights, for anything that would tell me I wasn't alone on this road. The fog pressed against my windows like something solid, like something with weight. And I had the strangest thought that if I opened my door, it wouldn't drift in. It would pour in, fill the car until I drowned in it. That's when I saw the sign. Mile marker 23. I'd passed mile marker 23 10 minutes ago. I was sure of it. Should have been at mile marker 28 by now, at least. But there it was in my headlights, clear as anything. That green rectangle with the white numbers. I told myself I'd been more distracted than I thought, that I'd gotten turned around somehow, even though the road had been straight for the last 20 minutes. There was no way to turn around on this stretch. No side roads, no driveways. Just 2 lanes cutting through the coastal forest with the ocean somewhere beyond the mist to my left. I drove for another 15 minutes, my speedometer holding steady at 25, my eyes aching from staring into that gray nothingness. When the next mile marker appeared, my stomach dropped. Mile marker 23. The exact same sign, same position, same everything. I hit the brakes hard enough to make my tires squeal, and the car shuddered to a stop in the middle of the highway. My first thought was that I'd somehow gotten myself into a loop, that there was some turnoff I kept taking without realizing it. But I'd been watching the road like a hawk, and there had been nothing. Just straight highway and fog. I sat there for maybe 3 minutes, engine idling, trying to make sense of it. My phone had no signal. Hadn't had signal since Cannon Beach, which was normal for this stretch, but suddenly felt a lot more sinister. The GPS on my dashboard was spinning uselessly, the little blue dot that represented my car circling around and around, like it couldn't figure out where I was, or like I wasn't anywhere at all. I put the car back in drive and kept going, because what else was I going to do? Sleep in my car until morning and hope the fog lifted? Something about that idea terrified me more than driving. Mile marker 23 appeared again 12 minutes later. This time I didn't stop. I pressed the accelerator down and watched my speed climb to 40, then 50, pushing through the fog even though I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The road stayed straight. It had to end somewhere, had to spit me out into Seaside or back into Cannon Beach or anywhere that wasn't this gray prison. But the next sign I passed was mile marker 23 again, and then again 3 minutes after that. And I realized with a cold clarity that cutting through my fear like a knife that I wasn't moving forward anymore. I was stuck. I pulled over onto what I hoped was the shoulder, my tires crunching on gravel, and turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and total. No ocean waves, no wind, no distant traffic, just my own ragged breathing and the tick-tick-tick of my cooling engine. I tried my phone again, knowing it was useless, and stared at the no service message until my eyes watered. When I looked up at the rearview mirror, I saw movement in the fog behind me. It was just a shadow at first, a darkness within the gray that seemed to be moving closer to my car. I watched it in the mirror, my hand frozen on the door lock as it took shape. Not a person, not exactly. The proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, limbs that bent in places where joints shouldn't exist. It moved with a strange gliding motion, like it wasn't quite touching the ground, and it was heading straight for my back window. I stopped breathing. For maybe 10 seconds, I sat there in perfect silence while that thing got closer and closer, until I could see what might have been a head tilting to one side like it was studying me, trying to figure out what I was. I started the car and drove. I didn't ease back onto the highway. I punched the gas and felt the tires spin before catching, throwing gravel against the undercarriage as I swerved back onto the pavement. In the rearview mirror, the shadow thing was still there, but it was farther away now, receding into the fog. Or maybe just waiting. I kept my foot down, pushing 60 now, and the mile markers started appearing faster. Mile marker 23, mile marker 23. Mile marker 23. Over and over, like a metronome, like the road was mocking me. That's when I heard the sound from outside. A voice, my voice, calling my name from somewhere in the fog to my left, from the direction where the ocean should have been. It wasn't an echo. It was perfect, exactly how I sounded when I called out in confusion or fear. And it was saying my name over and over with increasing desperation. I clamped my hands over my ears and kept driving. But I could still hear it through my palms, through the glass, through everything. My own voice begging me to stop, to help, to come find whoever was calling out there in the gray. The shadow appeared in front of my car this time. I had maybe 2 seconds to register it before I would have hit it. And I swerved hard to the right. The car went off the road, bounced over something that might have been a shoulder or might have been nothing. And then I was plowing through underbrush and small trees, branches scraping along both sides like fingernails on a chalkboard. I slammed on the brakes, and the car lurched to a stop against something solid. The airbag didn't deploy. The engine was still running. And when I looked out my windshield, I saw lights. Not headlights, not street lights. Small points of blue-white light drifting through the fog like fireflies, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, moving with purpose toward my car. They bobbed and weaved through the gray, and as they got closer, I could see they were attached to something, or maybe they were growing out of something. These pale, luminescent threads that trailed behind each light like roots or veins. The first one reached my hood, and I got a good look at it. Not a firefly, not anything natural. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and where it touched my car, Frost spread across the metal in delicate crystalline patterns. I threw the car into reverse, and the tires spun uselessly. I was stuck against whatever I'd hit, probably a tree, and the lights were covering my hood now, spreading across the windshield, and everywhere they touched the glass turned white with ice. My breath was fogging the air inside the car, even though the heater was still running full blast. I could feel the cold seeping through the doors, through the floor, through everything. And those lights were still coming, hundreds of them now, a whole galaxy of wrong stars descending through the fog toward me. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and kicked open the driver's side door. The lights scattered away from the movement like startled fish, and I ran. I didn't know which direction I was running, couldn't see more than 5 feet ahead. But I crashed through the underbrush with my arms up, protecting my face, and ran until my lungs burned. Behind me, I could hear something else running too. Something big. Something that snapped branches like toothpicks and breathed in wet, rattling gasps that echoed through the fog. My foot hit pavement and I almost fell. Highway 101. I'd made it back to the road, and ahead of me, maybe 20 yards away, I could see a light. Not one of those blue-white things, but warm and yellow and steady. A street light. Beyond it, I could make out the shapes of buildings, the glow of neon signs, the blessed, ordinary sight of a town. Seaside. I'd made it to Seaside somehow. And as I ran toward those lights, the fog began to thin, began to lift. And behind me, whatever had been chasing stopped at the roadway, like it had hit an invisible wall. I didn't stop running until I reached the gas station on the edge of town. There was a clerk inside, a kid maybe 19, and he looked up at me with mild concern as I burst through the door, gasping and wild-eyed. He asked if I was okay. I started to tell him what happened, started to describe the fog and the loop and the lights and the thing that chased me. But when I looked back toward the highway, I saw nothing but clear night sky and stars. The fog had vanished completely, like it had never been there at all. My car was still out there somewhere, stuck in the woods near mile marker 23. But when the police drove me back to find it 2 hours later, we passed mile marker 23, and it was just normal roadside, just trees and shoulder and highway, exactly like it should be. No tire tracks leading off into the brush, no damage to the trees, nothing. They never found my car. And sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls in off the ocean, I wonder if it's still out there. Still stuck at mile marker 23. Still circling that same impossible loop. Still waiting for me to come back and finish the drive. I went to the Olympic National Forest because I wanted silence. 3 days, solo camping, no phone service, no people. Just me and a tent pitched somewhere deep enough that the modern world couldn't find me. I'd been planning it for months, studying maps of the dispersed camping areas, finding a spot about 8 miles in from the nearest forest road where the trails barely existed and the trees grew so thick that even at noon the forest floor stayed dim. The kind of place where you could hear yourself think, where you could be alone with your thoughts without the constant noise of civilization drowning them out. The hike in took me 5 hours because I kept stopping to check my compass, making sure I was heading in the right direction through terrain that didn't have anything resembling a marked path. The trees here were massive. Douglas fir and Sitka spruce towering 300 feet overhead, their trunks wider than my car and covered in moss so thick it looked like green fur. The forest floor was a maze of fallen logs, ferns, and undergrowth that grabbed at my boots with every step. By the time I found the clearing I'd marked on my map, a small open space beside a creek where I could set up camp. The sun was already sinking behind the canopy, and the temperature was dropping fast. I set up my tent, got a fire going, ate a cold dinner because I didn't feel like cooking, and sat there listening to the forest settle into night. It was exactly what I'd wanted. Perfect silence broken only by the occasional call of ravens echoing through the trees and the soft rush of the creek 10 yards from my campsite. I stayed up until maybe 10 o'clock, watching the fire die down to coals. And then I crawled into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes with a kind of contentment that only comes from being completely alone in the wilderness. The whistle woke me up at 2:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch immediately, that automatic response when you're jolted awake and trying to figure out what's wrong. It was my whistle, the specific 3-note pattern I used when I was hiking alone, the way I'd blow on my emergency whistle to scare off animals or signal for help if I needed it. 3 short bursts, pause, 3 short bursts. And it was coming from the forest about 30 yards behind my tent. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened. Maybe I dreamed it. Maybe some bird made a sound that my half-asleep brain interpreted as a whistle. But then it came again, clearer this time. 3 notes, pause, 3 notes. Exactly the pattern I used, exactly the same rhythm. I unzipped my sleeping bag and reached for my flashlight, my heart starting to pound harder than it should have. There were other hikers in this forest, had to be, even though I'd chosen this spot specifically because it was far from any established trails. Someone else was out here, and they were signaling. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they needed help. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside into air so cold it burned my lungs. My fire had gone completely out. Just dark ashes in the ring, and the forest around me was black except for where my flashlight beam cut through the darkness. I whistled back. 3 short bursts, the signal I'd always used. If someone was lost out there, I wanted them to know I'd heard them, that help was close. The whistle came back immediately, but this time it wasn't 30 yards away. It was closer, maybe 20 yards. Still behind my tent, still in the trees, but it had moved. I called out, asked if anyone was there, if they needed help, my voice sounding small and uncertain in all that darkness. No response. Just the rush of the creek and the wind moving through the canopy overhead. I waited maybe 2 minutes. My flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the tree line, looking for movement, for the reflection of eyes, for anything. When the whistle came again, it was from my left, maybe 15 yards away now, and it was perfect. 3 notes, exact same pitch, exact same duration, like someone had recorded me and was playing it back. I went back inside my tent. I'm not proud of it. But I zipped myself in and sat there in the darkness with my flashlight off, listening. The whistle moved around my campsite in a slow circle, coming from different directions every few minutes. Behind me, then to my right, then in front of me near the creek, then back to my left. Always closer. Always that same 3-note pattern that I'd used 100 times on hikes. That I'd never taught anyone else, that shouldn't exist anywhere except in my own memory. At 3:45 a.m., I heard my own voice calling from the forest. It said my name. Just once, questioning, like I was looking for someone and calling out to see if they were nearby. The tone was perfect. The inflection was exactly how I sounded when I was uncertain about something. And it came from maybe 10 yards away, just beyond the edge of the clearing where my tent sat. I didn't respond. I sat there with my hand over my mouth to keep from making any sound, and I listened as my voice called out again, this time from a different direction. Then again. Then again. Moving around the clearing, circling my tent, my own voice asking for myself over and over in the darkness. When the sun finally started to rise around 6 a.m., I hadn't slept. I'd sat there for hours listening to that thing out in the forest, using my sounds, testing them, calling them out like it was trying to figure out what they meant. My whistle, my voice, and then around 5 a.m., my footsteps. The exact sound my boots made when I walked. The crunch of pine needles and the snap of twigs, circling the tent in a slow, methodical pattern. Whatever was out there had been listening to me, learning me, mimicking every sound I'd made since I arrived. I waited until full daylight before I opened my tent. The clearing looked exactly like it had the night before. Just my dead. Fire and the creek and the trees. No footprints except mine. No signs that anything had been here. I should have packed up and left immediately, hiked those 8 miles back to my car and never looked back. But I'd planned 3 days and I'd only been here 1 night. I told myself it was an animal, maybe an elk or a bird with some kind of unusual call that my tired brain had misinterpreted. The Olympic Peninsula had Roosevelt elk, and they made strange sounds during mating season. That had to be it. I spent the day hiking around my campsite, exploring the creek, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I didn't use my whistle. I tried not to talk to myself, which I usually did when I was alone. That habit of narrating your own actions just to hear a human voice. By the time evening came, I'd almost succeeded in believing that last night had been my imagination working overtime in an unfamiliar place. I made a real dinner, got my fire going strong, and settled in with a book as the sun went down. The sound started at 9:30 p.m., while there was still a little light left in the sky. My voice, coming from the trees, saying the things I'd said to myself during the day. Okay, let's see what's downstream. Should probably filter more water before it gets dark. Fire's looking good. Every phrase I'd spoken out loud played back to me from the darkness in my own voice. Perfect recordings that shouldn't exist because I hadn't brought any recording equipment. And between each phrase, I heard my footsteps, my whistle, the sound of me unzipping my tent, the sound of me pouring water from my bottle. Every noise I'd made, cataloged and repeated. I put out my fire and got in my tent at 10 p.m., 2 hours earlier than I'd planned, because I couldn't stand sitting there listening to myself echoing back from the forest. That's when the testing started. My voice would call out a phrase, and then there would be silence, like whatever was out there was waiting to see if I'd respond. When I didn't, it would try a different phrase, a different tone. Hello? Is someone there? I think I'm lost. My own voice, speaking words I'd never said, like it was experimenting with combinations, trying to figure out what would make me answer. At midnight, I heard it at my tent. Not just near my tent, but right outside, so close I could hear breathing that sounded exactly like my breathing, that same rhythm and depth. And then it started making the sounds I was making inside the tent. The rustle of my sleeping bag when I shifted position. The sound of me scratching my arm. The exact noise my watch made when I pressed the button to check the time. It was matching me movement for movement, sound for sound, like it was learning to be me. I grabbed my pack and I ran. I didn't wait for morning, didn't bother with my tent or my gear except for what I could carry. I turned on my headlamp and I ran through that forest in the darkness, branches whipping, my face, my boots catching on roots and logs, falling twice and getting back up without stopping. Behind me, I could hear my own footsteps, my own breathing, my own voice calling, "Wait, where are you going?" in perfect replication. It followed me for maybe 2 miles before the sounds finally stopped. And I didn't slow down till I saw my car in the pale light of dawn. I reported it to the ranger station on my way out, told them there was something in the forest that was mimicking sounds, that it might be dangerous, that other hikers should be warned. The The ranger looked at me with the kind of patient concern they probably reserve for people who've spent too long alone in the wilderness and let their imagination run wild. He said they'd received a few similar reports over the years, always from solo campers in the deep forest, always describing something that learned their sounds and played them back. He said most people figured it was just the acoustics of the forest, the way sound bounces off all those trees and creates strange echoes. But I go back sometimes and read the missing persons reports from Olympic National Forest, the hikers who went in alone and never came back out. And I wonder if maybe they heard it too. If maybe they heard their own voice calling from the darkness and they answered. If maybe whatever is out there in those trees finally learned enough to get them to come closer, to walk into the forest and keep walking until they were too far in to ever find their way back. I took the winter security job at Crater Lake because it paid well, and nobody else wanted it. November through March, the park closes to visitors. The roads get buried under 30 feet of snow, and the only way in or out is by snowmobile. It's just you, the research station, and the deepest lake in America, sitting in the caldera of a dead volcano, frozen solid under a blanket of white that makes the whole place feel like another planet. The job description said I'd be checking buildings, monitoring weather equipment, and making sure nobody tried to access the park illegally during the off-season. What it didn't mention was the isolation, the kind that gets into your bones after the first week, when you realize you haven't heard another human voice except your own. I'd been there for 6 weeks when it started. February, middle of the night, temperature hovering around -15 degrees. I was doing my routine patrol around the rim, checking the observation points and making sure the snow hadn't damaged any of the structures. The lake was frozen, had been since December, this perfect white circle surrounded by cliffs that dropped nearly 2,000 feet to the surface. At night, with just my headlamp cutting through the darkness, it looked like a portal to nothing. Like if you walked out onto that ice, you'd just keep falling through emptiness forever. I was at the North Rim overlook when I saw the first light. Not on the surface, but under it. A pale blue glow, maybe 50 feet down beneath the ice, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. I stopped walking and stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My first thought was that it was some kind of bioluminescence, maybe algae or bacteria that survived in the lake even in winter. But Crater Lake doesn't have anything like that. The water is too pure, too cold, too deep. The lake is fed entirely by snow and rain, no rivers flowing in or out. And at 1,900 feet deep, it's basically sterile at the bottom. The light pulsed again, brighter this time, and I saw another one appear maybe 100 yards to the left. Then another, then 10 more, scattered across the frozen surface like stars coming out at dusk. All of them deep beneath the ice, all of them pulsing in the same slow rhythm. I pulled out my radio and called back to the research station, described what I was seeing, asked if there was any equipment in the lake that might be generating light. The night researcher, a woman named Dr. Patterson, who was studying winter water temperatures, told me there was nothing down there. No instruments, no sensors, nothing that could produce light. She asked me to document it, take photos, keep watching. I stood there for 20 minutes while those lights multiplied. By 3 a.m., there were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, spreading across the entire visible surface of the lake like a galaxy reflected in dark water. They were getting brighter too, bright enough now that I could see them without my headlamp, bright enough that they were casting a faint blue glow on the surrounding cliffs. And they were rising. Slowly, maybe a foot every few minutes, but definitely moving upward through the water toward the ice. That's when my radio died. Not the battery, because I'd just changed it that morning. But the whole unit just went silent mid-transmission while I was updating Dr. Patterson. I tried my backup radio, my cell phone, even the emergency beacon I carried for avalanche situations. Nothing worked. Every piece of electronic equipment I had just stopped functioning all at once, like something had reached out and switched them all off simultaneously. I was standing there in the darkness with just my headlamp and those lights rising from the deep. And for the first time since I'd taken this job, I felt genuinely afraid. I should have gone back to the station right then. Should have gotten on the snowmobile and driven the 2 miles back to where Dr. Patterson was, where there were other people and warmth and lights that made sense. But I couldn't stop watching. Those lights were beautiful in a way that made my chest ache, in a way that felt wrong. And I stood there at the rim while they rose higher and higher through the water, until they were just beneath the ice. That's when I realized they weren't random. They were forming a pattern, arranging themselves into shapes that looked almost like symbols, like some kind of written language made of lights spelling out words I couldn't read. The ice started to crack at 3:47 a.m. I heard it first, that distinctive sound of ice under pressure, the groaning and popping that echoes across frozen lakes right before they break. But this was louder, deeper, a sound I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. The lights beneath the surface were so bright now they hurt to look at directly, and the pattern they'd formed was complete, covering the entire visible lake in geometric precision. And then something moved down there. Something vast. Something that displaced so much water that I saw the ice bulge upward in the center of the lake, rising in a dome that had to be 50 feet high. I ran. Not back to the station, because that would have meant turning my back on the lake, but along the rim road, parallel to the water, my headlamp bouncing wildly as my boots struggled for purchase in the deep snow. Behind me, I could hear the ice shattering, great booming cracks that sounded like artillery fire. And when I looked back, I saw water fountaining up through the broken ice, black water full of those blue lights that were now rising into the air like they were alive. They hovered above the lake, hundreds of feet up, and in their glow I could see what was beneath them. It wasn't a creature. It was too big to be a creature, too alien in its geometry to be anything that had ever evolved on Earth. It looked like a structure, like something built, rising from the depths of Crater Lake with a slowness that suggested immense size and weight. I could see pieces of it breaking the surface, angular and black and covered in those lights. And the more that emerged, the more I realized that what I was looking at had been down there for a very long time. Long enough to predate the lake itself. Long enough to have been there when Mount Mazama was still a mountain, before the eruption that created the caldera, before human beings ever walked this continent. The Klamath tribes called Crater Lake a doorway to the below world. They said that spirits lived in its depths, that the lake could trap you if you stared too long, that something evil named Lao had been imprisoned here after a great battle with the spirits of the above world. Standing there watching that thing rise from water that was never supposed to hold anything but snow melt, I understood that those weren't myths. They were warnings. They were the only way people who witnessed this thousands of years ago could describe what they'd seen, the only language they had for something so far beyond human comprehension that calling it a spirit was the kindest interpretation. I made it back to the research station at 4:15 a.m. Dr. Patterson was outside, staring toward the lake with her face completely white. And when I reached her, she grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and said she'd been watching it on the remote cameras. She said the structure had risen 300 feet out of the water and stopped just hanging there in the darkness above the shattered ice. And all our instruments were showing readings that made no sense. Temperature spikes of 200 degrees in the lake water, magnetic field distortions that were making compasses spin, seismic activity that suggested something was hollowing out the mountain beneath our feet. We evacuated. Not officially, because there was no official protocol for what to do when something impossible rises from the deepest lake in America. But we packed what we could carry on the snowmobiles, and we left. Dr. Patterson said we needed to report it, needed to call the Park Service and the Research Institute and probably the military. But when we got to the ranger station 15 miles away and tried to tell them what we'd seen, our radios started working again, and the story sounded insane, even to my own ears. They sent a team back 3 days later. Dr. Patterson and I weren't allowed to go with them. Were told to stay at the ranger station while they investigated. They came back 6 hours later and said everything was normal. The ice was intact. The cameras showed nothing unusual. All the instruments were functioning perfectly and showed no anomalous readings from that night. They said we'd probably experienced some kind of shared hallucination brought on by isolation and altitude. That winter security at Crater Lake was notorious for playing tricks on people's minds. That we should take some time off and consider whether this was really the right job for us. But I've seen the satellite photos from that night. You can find them if you know where to look. Images captured by weather satellites that happened to be passing over southern Oregon at 3:50 a.m. on February 19th. The government scrubbed them from the official databases. But they missed a few mirrors, a few private archives. In those photos, you can see Crater Lake, and you can see something rising from it, something that blocks out the stars behind it, something so large it casts a shadow across 20 miles of snow-covered forest. The lake is open to tourists again now. Summer brings thousands of people who stand at the rim and take pictures of that impossibly blue water and talk about how peaceful it is, how pristine. And I wonder what's down there in the depths, whether it went back down or whether it's still there, waiting. The Klamath people won't go near the lake after dark, won't even look at it directly for too long. They say if you stare at Crater Lake, it stares back, that it can trap you, hold you, pull you down into depths where pressure alone would crush you into nothing. I believe them now. And sometimes, late at night, I still see those lights when I close my eyes, still feel that vast presence moving beneath the ice. Whatever rose from Crater Lake that night, it's been there for thousands of years, buried under water cold enough and deep enough to hide anything. And the only thing more terrifying than knowing it's down there is wondering what would happen if it decided to fully wake up. I found the old Keller cannery on a low tide in March, half buried in the sand where the Willapa Bay meets the Pacific. It had been abandoned since 1953, according to the faded historical marker I'd passed a mile back. One of those turn-of-the-century fish processing plants that used to dot the Washington coast before regulations and economics shut them all down. I was shooting for an urban exploration blog, documenting forgotten pieces of industrial America, and this place was perfect. Rusted metal siding, broken windows, the whole structure listing to one side like it was trying to crawl back into the ocean that had been slowly claiming it for 70 years. The entrance was a loading dock that faced the beach, a concrete platform with stairs leading up to double doors that hung open on broken hinges. I checked my tide app before I went inside. Low tide had hit at 2:15 p.m., which gave me roughly 4 hours before the water came back in. Plenty of time to explore, take my photos, and get out before the bay surrounded the building like it did twice a day. The cannery sat on a spit of land that went completely underwater during high tide, turning the structure into a temporary island for 6 hours at a stretch. Local kids used to dare each other to stay inside during the tide change, back before the county put up fencing and warning signs that had long since been torn down by vandals and storms. Inside was exactly what I'd hoped for. Cathedral ceilings with holes where the roof had collapsed, light streaming through in dusty shafts that illuminated decades of decay. The main processing floor was massive, maybe 200 feet long, filled with rusted conveyor belts and machinery I couldn't identify. All of it covered in bird droppings and barnacles from the high tides that invaded twice daily. The smell was incredible. That mixture of salt and rust and rotting wood that made my eyes water. I started shooting immediately, getting wide angles of the space, close-ups of the machinery, the way nature was reclaiming everything slowly but inevitably. I'd been inside maybe 20 minutes when I found the first body. Not a skeleton, which would have been old enough to be historical, impersonal, maybe even expected in a place like this. This was recent. Maybe a few months old, hard to tell with the salt and the scavengers. But recent enough that I could still see fabric on what remained. It was wedged behind one of the old fish-gutting tables, partially hidden by a collapsed section of ceiling. And I almost missed it entirely. My first thought was homeless person, someone who'd sheltered here and died from exposure or an overdose. My second thought, the one that made my hands shake as I pulled out my phone to call 911, was that there was no way they'd gotten into that position by accident. No signal. I'd known that was a possibility out here. The coast had dead zones everywhere. But I'd figured I could always run back to my car if I needed to. I started walking toward the entrance, toward the loading dock and the beach beyond, still planning to leave and drive until I found service. That's when I heard the sound of the doors slamming shut. Not slowly, not pulled by wind, but hard like someone had put their weight behind them. I ran the last 30 feet and hit those doors at full speed, and they didn't budge. Something had been wedged against them from the outside, or locked, or both. I tried not to panic. There were other exits, had to be. Fire codes would have required multiple ways out, even back in the 1950s. I moved deeper into the cannery, into areas where the light from the broken roof didn't reach. Using my phone's flashlight to navigate through passages between machinery and rooms that had been offices or storage. That's when I found the others. 3 more bodies in various states of decay, all of them hidden in places where they wouldn't be immediately visible. All of them positioned in ways that suggested they hadn't died peacefully. One was in a freezer unit with the door torn off. One was in what used to be a supervisor's office. One was stuffed inside one of the large industrial barrels that had probably held fish guts 70 years ago. This wasn't a shelter for the homeless. This was a dumping ground. Someone had been using the Keller cannery to dispose of bodies, counting on the tide and the isolation and the fact that nobody in their right mind came out here to explore a building that spent half its life underwater. And whoever it was had locked me inside with their work. I checked my phone. 4:47 p.m. High tide would start flooding the lower levels in less than 2 hours, and I was standing in a building with no clear exits and at least 4 bodies that I knew of. Probably more I hadn't found yet. I tried every door on the main level, all locked or blocked from the outside. The windows were too small and too high up, and most of them still had rusted bars across them from when this place had been operational and valuable. I found a stairwell that led up to the 2nd floor, an administrative level that ran along one side of the building like a mezzanine overlooking the processing floor. More offices up there, all of them stripped bare except for broken furniture and mold. One of them had windows that faced the parking area where I'd left my car, and through those windows I could see someone standing next to my vehicle. Just standing there, not moving, looking toward the cannery. I ducked below the window line and waited, counting my heartbeats, trying to decide what to do. After 5 minutes, I looked again, and whoever it was had moved closer. It was maybe 50 yards from the building now, still just standing and watching. They were wearing waders and a rain jacket with the hood up, and they were carrying something long and dark that might have been a crowbar or a pipe. I watched them for another 10 minutes as they circled the cannery slowly, checking the approaches. And then they disappeared around the far side of the building where I couldn't see. The water started coming in at 5:30 p.m. I heard it first, that rushing sound of waves pushing through every gap and crack in the structure's foundation. And then I saw it. Dark water spreading across the processing floor below like spilled ink. It came in fast, rising several inches every few minutes. And within 20 minutes, the entire first floor was submerged under 2 feet of seawater. All those bodies I'd found were underwater now, floating probably, bumping against machinery in the current. The smell got worse as the water stirred everything up. 70 years of rot and death and decay, mixing with salt water and pushing up toward the second floor where I was trapped. I heard footsteps on the floor below, sloshing through water that was waist-deep now and rising. Whoever had locked me in had come inside, was moving through the flooded cannery with the confidence of someone who knew the layout perfectly, who had done this before. I moved away from the stairs, farther back into the administrative section, into a corner office that had probably belonged to the plant manager decades ago. There was no furniture except a metal desk bolted to the floor and a filing cabinet tipped on its side. No weapons, no way out. Just me and my phone showing 6:12 p.m. and no signal and a battery at 37%. The footsteps came up the stairs. Slow, methodical, water dripping off boots with each step. I could hear breathing, heavy and wet, echoing through the empty corridors of the second floor. I crouched behind the filing cabinet and tried to make myself smaller, tried not to breathe, tried not to think about what was going to happen when they found me. The footsteps stopped outside the office door. Silence for maybe 30 seconds. Just the sound of water rushing through the building below and my own pulse hammering in my ears. Then the door opened and someone stepped inside. They were bigger than I'd expected. Tall enough that they had to duck slightly through the doorway, broad-shouldered under that rain jacket. The hood was still up, and in the dim light I couldn't see their face, just shadow and the glint of something reflective where their eyes should be. They stood there for a long moment, head tilting slightly like they were listening. And then they spoke. Asked if I'd seen enough. Asked if I'd gotten good photos for my blog. They knew who I was. They'd known I was coming. I ran. Burst out from behind the filing cabinet and went for the door. Got past them because they hadn't expected me to charge directly at them, made it into the corridor and toward the stairs. Behind me, I heard them following, boots pounding on the metal floor. And I hit the stairs at full speed and went down into water that was chest deep now and shockingly cold. The first floor was almost completely flooded, the water still rising, and the current was stronger than I had anticipated. It pulled at me, tried to push me sideways into machinery, and I had to fight just to stay upright. I slogged toward where I thought the loading dock entrance was, using the faint light from the ceiling holes as navigation. And halfway there, my foot hit something soft underwater that grabbed my ankle. One of the bodies, floating in the current, tangled around my leg like it was trying to pull me down with it. I kicked free and kept moving, my lungs burning from the cold and the effort. And behind me, I could hear splashing as my pursuer entered the water. They were faster than me, knew the layout better, weren't exhausted from panic and fear. I found a gap in the wall where the metal siding had torn away, a hole maybe 3 feet wide that opened onto the exterior. The water was pouring through it in a rush, the tide flowing into the cannery faster than I'd thought possible. And beyond it, I could see open bay, No beach, no sand, just water stretching out to where my car would be completely submerged by now. The entire spit had flooded while I was trapped inside. But there was a piling maybe 20 yards away, one of those massive wooden posts that used to support docks, still standing after all these years with barnacles clustered around its base and the top jutting above the waterline. I squeezed through the gap and swam for it. The current tried to drag me parallel to the shore, out into the deeper water of the bay, and my clothes were lead weights trying to pull me down. Behind me, I heard metals screeching as something large forced its way through the hole I'd used, and then splashing as they came after me. I reached the piling and wrapped my arms around it, the barnacles cutting into my skin, and pulled myself up using the crossbeams that had once supported the dock. From there, I could see back to the cannery, to the figure in waders standing in the water up to their waist, watching me. They didn't follow further, just stood there as the tide continued to rise, as the water level inside the cannery climbed toward the ceiling and the bodies inside floated toward the surface. A fishing boat found me 2 hours later, a crabber heading back to port who saw someone clinging to a piling in the middle of Willapa Bay and called the Coast Guard. They asked me what happened, and I told them everything. And they went back to the cannery at the next low tide. Found my car, found my camera gear, found absolutely no evidence of any bodies or any person in waders. The building was empty, just rust and decay and the smell of salt and rot that I'll never get out of my memory. But sometimes I go back and read the missing persons reports from that area, the hikers and drifters and tourists who vanished near Willapa Bay over the years. And I count them. 17 in the last decade alone. 17 people who were never found, who disappeared without a trace in an area with miles of isolated coastline and abandoned structures that spend half their time underwater. And I wonder how many more bodies are hidden in that cannery. How many more the tide will eventually wash out into the Pacific, where they'll never be identified. How many more it will take before someone finally believes me. I'd been running the feller buncher for Cascade Timber for 11 years, and in all that time, I'd never seen trees marked the way these ones were. We'd moved into a new section of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in early November, one of the last old-growth parcels that hadn't been touched since the Northwest Forest Plan restrictions got revised. The trees here were massive. Douglas fir and western red cedar that had been growing since before the United States existed, their trunks wider than my machine and so tall you couldn't see the tops even in full daylight. Most of them were scheduled for harvest, standard clear-cut operation, but 3 of them had markings I'd never seen before. They were carved directly into the bark about 6 feet up the trunk, symbols that looked almost like letters, but weren't any alphabet I recognized. Deep cuts, old enough that the wood had darkened and healed around the edges, but still visible enough that you couldn't miss them. I asked Jackson, our crew boss, what they meant. He said they were probably Native American trail markers from before the Forest Service took over the land, that they didn't mean anything relevant to our operation. The trees were marked for cutting, all the permits were in order, and we had a quota to meet before the winter weather shut us down for the season. We started cutting on a Tuesday morning in mid-November. 8 of us on the crew, running 3 feller bunchers, 2 skidders, and a loader to move the logs to the landing area where the trucks could haul them out. Standard operation, the kind we'd done 100 times before. I took the north section, working my way through trees that were probably 300 years old, watching them fall in perfect controlled drops that shook the ground hard enough to feel through the cab of my machine. By lunch, we'd cleared maybe 2 acres, and by the end of the day, we'd dropped at least 60 trees. Good progress. The kind that made management happy and kept the paychecks coming. It was on the second day that I reached the trees with the symbols. 3 of them growing in a rough triangle maybe 30 yards apart, each one marked with those same strange carvings. I radioed Jackson to confirm they were on the cut list, even though I knew they were. Something about those symbols making me hesitate in a way I couldn't quite explain. He confirmed, said the surveyor had already checked them, that they were just old trees with old graffiti, nothing special. So I lined up my feller buncher and engaged the shear mechanism. Watched those massive hydraulic blades close around a trunk that was probably 6 feet in diameter. The tree didn't fall right. I'd cut thousands of trees, and you develop an instinct for how they're going to drop, the way the weight distributes, the exact moment when the trunk gives way and gravity takes over. This one fell too fast, like something had pushed it, and it hit the ground with a sound that wasn't just wood striking earth. It was deeper, resonant, like I'd just rung some enormous bell that echoed through the entire forest. The other sounds stopped immediately. The chainsaws from the crew working the south section, the diesel engines of the skidders, even the birds. Everything went silent for maybe 10 seconds. And in that silence, I heard something else. A sound like wind moving through branches. Except there was no wind. I cut the other 2 marked trees before the end of my shift. Had to. They were on the list, and we were already behind schedule from weather delays earlier in the month. Both of them fell wrong. Both of them made that same resonant sound. And after the third one came down, I looked back at the clear cut we'd created and felt something I'd never felt before in 11 years of logging. Guilt. Not the abstract environmental guilt that everyone who works timber learns to ignore, but something immediate and personal, like I'd just torn down someone's house while they were still inside. The crew knocked off at 5 p.m. like always. We had maybe an hour of light left, but company policy was strict about working after dark. Too many accidents with equipment operators who couldn't see properly in the shadows. I radioed in that I was going to finish the row I was working on, maybe another 30 minutes. Then I'd head back to the landing. Jackson said, "Fine, just don't push it." And then I heard the sounds of the other machines shutting down and driving away toward the access road 2 miles west. Their engines faded into the distance. And then it was just me and my feller buncher in a forest that was half standing trees and half stumps stretching across acres of torn earth. I finished my row at 5:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch before I started the drive back, wanted to make sure I'd be off the mountain before full dark. I put the feller buncher in drive and started following my own tracks back toward the landing, moving at maybe 5 miles per hour through terrain that was all roots and debris. That's when I heard the first skidder start up behind me. Its engine was distinctive, a deep rumble that I'd heard every day for years, and it was coming from somewhere back in the section I'd just finished cutting. I stopped my machine and radioed to ask who was still on site. No response. Tried again, calling for Jackson, for Martinez, who ran one of the skidders, for anyone. Static. My radio was working. I could hear the carrier wave, but nobody was answering. The skidder engine got louder, coming closer, and then I heard the second one start up from a different direction. Then the third feller buncher, its hydraulic pump whining as the boom arm moved. All our equipment running simultaneously, all of it moving, and I was alone. I drove faster, pushing the feller buncher to maybe 10 miles per hour, which was reckless on terrain this rough, but suddenly seemed necessary. Behind me, I could hear multiple machines now, all of them moving through the clear cut in what sounded like a coordinated pattern. They were closer than they should be, moving faster than those machines were designed to move. And when I risked a glance back through the cab window, I saw lights. Not headlights, not the standard safety lights we kept on all equipment, but something else. The same blue-white glow I'd seen once before, on a long dead tree stump that had some kind of bioluminescent fungus growing on it. except this was brighter, coming from inside the cabs of machines that shouldn't have anyone operating them. My feller buncher died at 6:03 p.m. Engine just quit, all the hydraulics went dead, and I coasted to a stop in the middle of a debris field of fallen branches and torn earth. I tried the ignition. Nothing. Checked the battery connections, the fuel lines, everything I could reach from inside the cab. Everything was fine. Everything should have been working, but the machine was completely dead. And behind me, maybe 200 yards back, I could see 3 sets of lights moving through the clear cut toward my position. I got out of the cab. Standard protocol says stay with your equipment if it breaks down. Wait for pickup. Don't try to walk out in the dark. But standard protocol doesn't account for your own equipment hunting you through a forest you just destroyed. I started running toward where the landing should be, using the stumps as navigation points, trying to stay oriented in terrain that all looked identical now that we'd stripped it bare. The lights behind me spread out, circling around my position like they were trying to cut off my escape routes, and I could hear them getting closer. The grinding of treads on rough ground, the hydraulic hiss of booms extending, the mechanical sounds of machines doing what machines do. The loader caught me first. I saw its lights sweep across the clear cut ahead of me, and I dove behind a stump that was wide enough to provide cover. The machine rolled past, maybe 20 yards away, its grapple arms sweeping back and forth like it was searching for something. Through gaps in the debris, I could see into the cab. See that there was no one inside, just darkness, and that blue-white glow coming from somewhere beneath the seat. The loader moved in a grid pattern, methodical and precise, searching every square foot of ground between me and where I needed to go. I waited until it passed, and then I ran again, breaking cover and sprinting across open ground toward a section of still-standing forest at the edge of the cut zone. If I could make it to the trees, to the old growth we hadn't reached yet, maybe the machines wouldn't follow. They were designed for clear cuts, for open terrain, not for navigating between massive trunks in dense forest. I made it maybe 50 yards before the skidder burst out of the darkness to my left, its blade lowered like a battering ram, engine screaming at maximum RPM. It should have hit me, should have run me down like an insect. But at the last possible second, I threw myself sideways into a slash pile of branches, and the skidder roared past. So close, I felt the heat from its exhaust. I crawled deeper into the slash pile and tried to become invisible. The branches were mostly from the marked trees. I recognized the deep red bark of the old cedar, and they were still green enough to have some give to them. I burrowed in until I was completely covered, and then I stayed there, breathing as quietly as I could, while the machine circled the area where I'd disappeared. They searched for maybe 20 minutes, lights sweeping back and forth, engines idling, and then one by one they shut down. Just went silent and dark like they'd run out of fuel simultaneously. I stayed hidden for another hour, until I was sure it wasn't a trick, until the cold had seeped so deep into my bones that I couldn't stop shaking. When I finally emerged from the slash pile, the clear cut was empty except for the dead machines sitting motionless in the darkness. My feller buncher, the skidders, the loader, all of them dark and silent right where they'd stopped. I walked to the landing, a 3-mile hike in pitch darkness over terrain that tried to break my ankles with every step. And when I got there, I found the crew trucks all lined up like they'd been parked normally at the end of shift. My truck started on the first try. I reported it the next morning, told Jackson that all the equipment had experienced simultaneous electrical failure, that we'd need mechanics on site before we could continue operations. He said that was impossible, that equipment didn't just die all at once, that I must have gotten confused in the dark and was reporting a problem that didn't exist. He sent a team back to the clear-cut to check the machines. They radioed back an hour later. Said every piece of equipment started perfectly, no mechanical issues, no electrical faults, everything running exactly as it should. But when I went back, when Jackson made me go back because leaving functional equipment on site overnight was a terminable offense, I saw something the mechanics had missed or chosen not to report. Every machine had been altered. The Feller Buncher's hydraulic shear had bent inward, twisted into a shape that couldn't have been created by any mechanical stress I understood. The skidder's blades had deep gouges carved into them, patterns that looked almost like letters. The loader's grapple had been torn partially free from its mounting, bent at angles that would require forces that shouldn't exist. And in the center of the clear-cut, where the 3 marked trees had stood, something was growing. Not new trees, those would take decades to emerge. Something else, a fungus maybe, or a moss, spreading out in a perfect circle from where the trunks had been, glowing faintly even in daylight with that same blue-white luminescence I'd seen in the machines. The circle was expanding, maybe an inch a day, and where it spread nothing else would grow. The replanting crew tried to seed the area that spring, and everything they planted inside the circle died within a week. Cascade Timber shut down that section a month later. Said it was due to environmental review complications, that the permits hadn't been properly filed, that we'd exceeded our allotted harvest area. But I've seen the reports from the other crews who tried to work that clear cut, the accident rates, the equipment failures, the way people started refusing to go into that section because something about it felt wrong. They put up fencing and warning signs and let the Forest Service take the land back. And as far as I know, nobody has cut timber there since. I quit logging 6 months later. Couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't line up on a tree without thinking about those symbols, about the sound they made when they fell, about machines that moved with purpose through the darkness. I hear they're opening up more old-growth areas to harvest, that the demand for lumber outweighs the environmental concerns, that there's good money to be made for crews willing to work the ancient forests that have been protected for decades. And I wonder how many more trees out there have those markings, how many more warnings are carved into bark that we're going to ignore, because permits trump everything, because wood is wood and money is money. And surely there's no consequence for cutting down trees that are older than our entire civilization. But late at night, I still hear that sound they made when they fell. That deep, resonant echo like I'd rung a bell that no one was supposed to ring. And I wonder what answered it, and how long until it finishes what it started in that clear cut where nothing will grow anymore. I picked him up at the rest stop just east of North Bend at 4:30 in the morning. He was standing under the single working streetlight in the parking area, thumb out, wearing jeans and a flannel jacket that looked too thin for November in the Cascades. I'd been running I-90 between Seattle and Spokane for 15 years, knew every rest stop and truck stop along the route, and I'd developed a policy early on about hitchhikers. Never pick 'em up. Too much risk, too much liability, too many stories about drivers who'd made that mistake and regretted it. But something about this guy made me stop. Maybe it was because he looked so ordinary. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. Or maybe it was because I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, and the loneliness was getting to me the way it sometimes did on these pre-dawn runs when the highway was empty, and the only voices were the ones in your own head. I pulled over on the shoulder and leaned across to roll down the passenger window. Asked him where he was headed. He said Spokane, same as me, and he climbed into the cab before I could change my mind. We drove in silence for the first 20 minutes, climbing the grade toward Snoqualmie Pass through darkness so complete, it felt like we were the only people left in the world. The highway curved through old-growth forest on both sides, massive trees pressing in close to the roadway, and my headlights carved out a tunnel of visibility that showed nothing but asphalt and the occasional reflector marking the shoulder. The hitchhiker sat with his hands folded in his lap, looking straight ahead, not fidgeting or checking his phone or doing any of the normal things people do when they're uncomfortable, just sitting there like he was waiting for something. He finally spoke when we crested the pass at 3,022 feet. Said he appreciated the ride, that not many truckers stopped for hitchhikers anymore, that people were too paranoid about strangers. I agreed. Said it was a liability thing mostly, that my company would fire me if they knew I'd picked someone up. He asked what company I worked for, and I told him. Pacific Northwest Freight. Been with them since 2010. He nodded like he'd already known that. And then he asked me if I remembered a night 10 years ago, February 19th, 2015, when I'd been driving this same route in weather a lot worse than tonight. The question hit me like a physical thing, made my hands tighten on the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. I said I'd been driving this route for 15 years, that I'd driven through plenty of bad weather, that I didn't remember anything specific about one night a decade ago. He said that was interesting, because he remembered it very clearly. Said it had been snowing that night, one of those late winter storms that came through the mountains and turned the pass into a white hell where you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Said there had been another hitchhiker that night, a girl, maybe 23 years old, and she'd been standing at this exact rest stop where I'd just picked him up. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. Told him he must have me confused with someone else, that I'd never picked up a hitchhiker before tonight. He turned to look at me then for the first time since getting in the truck, and in the glow from the dashboard lights, I could see his eyes, and they were completely wrong. Too dark, too knowing, like he could see straight through everything I was saying into the truth underneath. He said he wasn't confused at all. Said he knew exactly who I was, that he'd been looking for me for a long time. The highway dropped down the eastern slope of the pass toward Cle Elum, 4 lanes of empty interstate cutting through terrain that was all rocks and pine trees and darkness. I pushed my speed up to 70, then 75, suddenly wanting to get to Spokane as fast as possible, wanting to get this guy out of my truck and back to the anonymity of the road. He didn't seem bothered by the speed, just kept talking in that same calm voice, describing details from a night I'd spent 10 years trying to forget. He said the girl's name had been Sarah Kendrick. Said she'd been a student at University of Washington, was heading home to Spokane for a long weekend, and her car had broken down near North Bend. Said I'd picked her up around 3 a.m., promised her I'd get her home safe, and that she'd trusted me because truckers were supposed to be the good guys on the highway. He asked me if I remembered what we'd talked about during the first hour of the drive, before things changed. Before I'd taken the turnoff near Easton that led to an old logging road I knew about, a place where nobody went in winter. I denied it. Denied all of it. Said he was crazy, that he was making up stories, that I'd never done anything like what he was describing. My voice came out too loud in the enclosed space of the cab, panicked in a way that made the lie obvious even to my own ears. He reached into his jacket pocket and I flinched, thinking he was going for a weapon, thinking this was it. This was how it ended. But what he pulled out was a photograph. He turned on the overhead light and held it up where I could see it. Sarah Kendrick, blonde hair, bright smile, everything ahead of her that should have stayed ahead of her. The photo looked like it had been taken at a family gathering, Christmas maybe, everyone happy and together and completely unaware that in a few months she'd be gone. I looked at it for maybe 2 seconds before focusing back on the highway, and those 2 seconds were enough. Enough to confirm what I'd already known, what I'd been running from for a decade. He knew. Somehow this stranger sitting in my truck knew exactly what I'd done. He put the photo away and said Sarah's body had never been found. Said her family had spent years searching, had hired private investigators, had put up billboards along I-90 asking for information. Said they'd eventually accepted that she was gone, but they'd never understood why, never had closure, never got to bury their daughter. He said the case was still technically open, that the police still had evidence they'd collected, that they'd just never been able to connect it to a suspect. Until now. Until he'd found me. I asked him who he was, asked if he was a cop, if this was some kind of sting operation, if I needed to call my lawyer. He smiled for the first time, and it was worse than if he'd pulled a gun. Said he wasn't police, wasn't anything official, wasn't even technically alive anymore in the way I understood the concept. Said he was something else, something that had been called a lot of names over the centuries, but that basically existed to make sure certain debts got paid. He said Sarah had called out when she died, had sent out a signal into whatever lies beyond, and he'd answered. The highway stretched ahead into darkness that seemed to go on forever. We were past Cleellum now, heading into the long, empty stretch between the mountains and the Columbia River, where there was nothing but scrubland and the occasional ranch house miles off the highway. I couldn't pull over, couldn't stop the truck and tell him to get out. Because if what he was saying was true, if he really was what he claimed to be, then stopping wouldn't matter. He'd already found me, had been looking for me specifically, had waited at that exact rest stop knowing I'd come through on my usual schedule because he'd been studying my patterns, learning my routes, waiting for the right moment. He started listing details, times, dates, locations. 3 other girls over 8 years before Sarah. Names I'd tried to forget. Faces that still appeared in my dreams when I'd been driving too long and the road started to blur. He knew about the logging road near Easton, knew about the abandoned mine shaft near Vantage where I'd disposed of evidence, knew about the storage unit in Spokane, where I kept things that would convict me if anyone ever found them. He said he'd been to all those places, had seen everything, had reconstructed my crimes with a thoroughness that would impress a detective. I asked him what he wanted. Money, silence, what? He said he didn't want anything from me. Said that wasn't how this worked. He was just here to deliver a message, to make sure I understood the time was up, that I couldn't run anymore. He said Sarah's family would be getting an anonymous package in the mail next week, information that would lead police directly to me, evidence that would be impossible to explain away. He said I had maybe 7 days of freedom left, 7 days to decide how I wanted to spend them before the arrests and the trials and the inevitable conclusion. I hit the brakes. Just stomped down hard at 75 miles per hour on an empty highway, felt the weight of the trailer push against the cab as the whole rig shuddered and slowed. The hitchhiker didn't react, didn't brace himself or cry out, just sat there calmly as we skidded to a stop in the middle of I-90 with no other traffic in sight. I told him to get out. Told him I didn't care what he was or what he thought he knew, that he needed to get out of my truck right now. He said okay, that he'd done what he came to do anyway, that our business was concluded. He opened the door and stepped down onto the shoulder. And when he turned back to look at me, his eyes caught the light in a way that confirmed he wasn't human, wasn't anything that should exist in the world I understood. He said he'd be seeing me again, that we'd meet one more time before this was over. And then he walked away into the darkness beside the highway. I watched him go, watched until he disappeared completely into the scrubland. And then I sat there for maybe 10 minutes trying to decide what to do. I could run, could drive this truck to Canada or Mexico, could disappear into whatever life was waiting for people like me who'd finally been caught. Or I could keep going to Spokane, could deliver my load like normal, could pretend this night hadn't happened and wait to see if he was telling the truth about the package, about the evidence, about the 7 days. Or I could do what I should have done a decade ago, what I should have done after Sarah and the others. I could turn myself in. I made it another 40 miles before I pulled over at the rest stop near George Washington. Used the phone there to call 911, told them I had information about multiple missing persons cases, told them I needed to speak to a detective immediately. They told me to stay where I was, that someone would be there within the hour. I sat in my truck and watched the sun come up over the Columbia River Basin, watched the light spread across a landscape that looked alien and beautiful and completely indifferent to everything I'd done. The police arrived 53 minutes later. 3 cars, lights flashing, officers approaching with hands on their weapons like I might run. I didn't run. I put my hands on the steering wheel where they could see them, and I waited while they surrounded the truck. They asked me to step out slowly, asked if I was armed, asked if there was anyone else in the vehicle. I said no, that I was alone, that I'd been alone since the hitchhiker got out near Vantage. They searched the truck, found the hidden compartment I'd built into the sleeper cab, found the items I'd kept as trophies, found everything they needed to connect me to Sarah and the others. They arrested me right there, read me my rights against the background noise of trucks passing on the highway. Drivers who had no idea they were watching someone's life end. They asked me why I'd called them, why I'd turned myself in after getting away with it for so long. I told them about the hitchhiker, about what he'd said, about the package he claimed would be arriving at the Kendrick family home. The detective who interviewed me later said they'd checked with the family. No package had arrived. No anonymous tip had been received. Nothing had changed in the investigation until I'd called. He said I'd basically turned myself in for no reason, thrown away my freedom based on the word of someone who might not have even existed. He asked me to describe the hitchhiker again, to give details about his appearance, about what he'd said. I gave him the description, and he wrote it all down. But I could see in his face that he thought I was making excuses, trying to claim diminished capacity or supernatural coercion. But 3 days after my arrest, Sarah Kendrick's body was found. Hikers discovered her remains in a ravine off that logging road near Easton, exactly where I'd left her 10 years ago, in a location that should have been impossible to find without inside knowledge of the terrain and the crime. The medical examiner said recent rainfall had exposed the burial site, that it was pure chance she'd been discovered now after a decade of remaining hidden. The detective showed me photos of the recovery site and asked if I recognized it. I recognized it. But I also recognized something else in the background of one of the photos. A figure standing back in the trees, partially obscured by shadows and distance, but clearly visible if you knew what you were looking for. The same hitchhiker who'd ridden in my truck that night. Same flannel jacket, same ordinary face, same dark eyes. He was watching them recover Sarah's body, making sure it was done right, making sure her family would finally have their closure. The detective said I was looking at life without parole. 4 victims, premeditated murder, a pattern of predation that made me exactly the kind of criminal the system was designed to remove from society permanently. I accepted that. Accepted it because I deserved it. Because Sarah and the others deserved justice even if it came a decade late. But I also accepted it because I knew the alternative would be worse. The hitchhiker had given me a choice, had given me 7 days to make a decision, and I'd made the right one for the first time in a long time. I'm writing this from county jail while I wait for my trial. They monitor our communications, so if anyone reads this, they'll think it's just another inmate trying to explain away their crimes with ghost stories and supernatural excuses. But I know what I saw. Know what rode in my truck that night on I-90? What found me after years of thinking I'd gotten away with it? And sometimes late at night, when the cell block is quiet and I can hear nothing but my own breathing and the distant sound of traffic on the highway outside, I think about all the other people out there running from things they've done. All the other drivers on I-90 carrying secrets they think are buried deep enough to stay hidden forever. And I wonder how many of them will see a hitchhiker standing in the darkness at a rest stop, thumb out, ordinary face hiding something ancient and patient and utterly certain. How many of them will make the mistake of stopping? How many of them will hear their own crimes recited back to them in a calm voice, while the highway stretches ahead into darkness that never ends? I'd been studying the tide pools at Sinister Beach for 3 weeks when I found it. The research grant from the University of Washington had given me the entire month of October to document unusual marine life along the most remote stretches of the Olympic coast. And Sinister was about as remote as it got. 4 miles of hiking through rainforest just to reach the beach. No cell service, no facilities. Just me and my equipment camping on the sand and cataloging everything that lived in the pools carved into the rocky shelf that stretched out into the Pacific. The tide pool where I found it was deeper than most, maybe 6 feet across and 3 feet deep at low tide, tucked into a formation of basalt that created a natural barrier from the waves. I'd checked it a dozen times over the previous weeks and documented the usual species: sea stars, anemones, purple urchins, a few sculpin hiding under the rocks. Nothing unusual. But on October 23rd, during the lowest tide of the month, I saw something at the bottom that hadn't been there before. It was roughly the size of my fist, translucent with a faint blue tint, and covered in what looked like sensory filaments that waved slowly in the current created by my presence. I photographed it first, standard protocol, getting shots from multiple angles before attempting to collect a sample. Through my camera lens, I could see the filaments more clearly. They weren't random, weren't moving with the water flow, but instead seemed to be orienting themselves toward me, tracking my movements as I circled the pool. I'd never seen anything like it in 15 years of marine biology. The body structure didn't match any known phylum. The filaments were too complex, too purposeful in their movement. I reached into the water with my collection container, a sealed tube that would preserve whatever I caught for later analysis. The moment my hand broke the surface, every filament snapped toward me simultaneously. Not gradually, not with the delayed response of primitive nervous systems, but instantly, like it had predicted my action before I'd completed it. I pulled back and the filaments relaxed, resumed their slow waving pattern. I tried again from a different angle and got the same response. The thing was tracking me with a precision that suggested sophisticated sensory processing. I sat back on the rocks and watched it for maybe 20 minutes, testing reactions, timing responses. And the more I observed, the more I became convinced I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Intelligence requires neural complexity, requires a brain or, at minimum, a nerve net sophisticated enough to process information and generate adaptive responses. This thing was too small. Even if its entire mass was neural tissue, which was impossible given that I could see through it, there wasn't enough physical space for the kind of processing I was witnessing. But I watched it move through the pool, watched it avoid the urchins and interact with the anemones in ways that seemed almost communicative. And I knew I was seeing something that violated everything I understood about marine biology. The weather changed at 2:09 p.m. I'd been so focused on the organism that I hadn't noticed the clouds building over the ocean. That particular dark gray that meant serious weather was coming in fast. The wind picked up within minutes, going from calm to sustained 20-knot gusts that kicked up sand and made the surface of the tide pools ripple. I checked my weather radio. Storm warning issued at 1:30. Winds expected to reach 50 knots by evening. Heavy rain, dangerous surf. The kind of storm that made the hike out treacherous and turned Sinister Beach from paradise into a hostile environment where people got hurt. I should have started hiking immediately. Should have packed my gear and made for the trailhead while I still had time. But I couldn't leave the organism. Couldn't abandon the most significant biological discovery of my career to the incoming tide and storm surge that would almost certainly destroy it or wash it out to sea. I made the decision that every scientist who's ever died doing fieldwork has made. I decided the discovery was worth the risk. I started setting up emergency collection protocols, preparing to extract the organism and preserve it properly despite the deteriorating conditions. That's when I realized it had moved. Not within the pool, which I'd watched it do dozens of times, but between pools. The tide was going out, the water level dropping by inches every few minutes. And somehow the organism had traversed 15 feet of exposed rock to reach a pool that was closer to shore. Closer to the beach, closer to me. I looked back at the original pool and saw two more of them, both identical to the first, both oriented toward my position. They hadn't been there 30 minutes ago. I'd been watching that pool obsessively, and there had only been one organism. I approached the new pool carefully, and the organism at the bottom shifted, its filaments extending upward like it was reaching toward me. I could see its internal structure more clearly now. See the way fluids moved through channels that branched and rebranched in patterns that looked almost fractal. It pulsed once, a contraction that moved through its entire body, and a thin stream of something that might have been chemical communication or might have been waste shot out into the water. Within seconds, two more organisms appeared from under the rocks at the edge of the pool. They hadn't crawled out. They'd just been there suddenly, like they'd materialized. The rain started at 3:15 p.m., coming down hard enough to sting exposed skin and turn the tide pools into turbulent miniature oceans. I was soaked within seconds, my equipment getting hammered by water that was mixing salt spray with fresh rain in combinations that were hell on electronics. I tried to radio the ranger station to let them know I was sheltering on the beach until the storm passed. No signal. The storm was blocking transmission, and I was officially cut off from any help until the weather cleared, which according to my last weather report wouldn't be until tomorrow morning at the earliest. I retreated to my tent, which I'd set up in a small clearing just above the high tide line, and tried to dry off and think rationally about what I'd seen. Multiple organisms appearing where there had been one. Movement between pools across exposed rock, coordinated behavior that suggested communication or possibly something worse. Something that meant I wasn't looking at multiple organisms at all, but rather one organism that could separate itself into mobile units. Like a colonial organism, but with independent decision-making capability in each component. The biological implications were staggering, but the immediate practical implications were what concerned me. I looked out from my tent toward the tide pools and saw them. Dozens of the organisms now, maybe hundreds, spread across the rocky shelf in every pool, every depression that held water. And they were all oriented in the same direction, toward the beach, toward me. The tide was at its lowest point now and would turn within the hour, coming back in to reclaim the shelf and everything on it. But these things weren't waiting for the tide. I watched through my camera's telephoto lens as one of them extended its filaments, gripped the rock at the edge of its pool, and pulled itself up onto dry land. It didn't die. Marine organisms pulled from water typically have minutes at most before cellular damage becomes irreversible. before they suffocate or desiccate beyond recovery. This thing moved across the exposed rock like it had been designed for land. Filaments gripping and pulling in a locomotion that was slow but steady and completely functional in air. It reached the next pool and slid into the water, but a dozen more were already following the path it had established. They were coming out of the ocean, leaving their natural habitat deliberately, and they were all heading toward my position. I broke camp in under 10 minutes, threw everything I could carry into my pack, and started moving up the beach, away from the tide pools. The storm was fully developed now, waves crashing onto the shore with enough force to send spray 50 feet inland. Wind tearing at my rain gear, visibility down to maybe 30 yards through the rain. I looked back and saw a line of those organisms stretching from the tide pools across the sand, dozens of them making steady progress toward where my tent had been, moving faster than they should be able to, adapting to terrestrial locomotion with a speed that suggested they'd done it before. The beach ended at a headland, a rocky point that jutted into the ocean and couldn't be crossed except at low tide, which had already passed. I was trapped on this stretch of sand, with a storm at my back and something that shouldn't exist advancing across terrain it shouldn't be able to survive. I climbed up into the rocks above the beach, found a formation that gave me protection from the wind and height advantage to observe. Through the rain, I could see them spreading out, covering the sand in a pattern that looked like a search grid. They were looking for me, specifically, had somehow identified me as a target or a threat, or possibly just as something to study the same way I'd been studying them. One of them found my trail, the disturbed sand where I'd run from my campsite toward the rocks. It followed the track exactly, moving faster now, and within seconds, a dozen more had converged on the same trail. They were communicating, had to be, coordinating their search with an efficiency that spoke of intelligence that went beyond simple stimulus response. I watched them follow my path, right to the base of the rocks where I'd climbed, watched them pool at the bottom like water gathering before a flood. They started climbing, filaments extending, gripping microscopic holds in the basalt, pulling their bodies upward with the same methodical progress they'd shown on the sand. I moved higher, scrambling up rock faces that were slick with rain until I reached a ledge maybe 40 feet above the beach where I couldn't climb any further without equipment I didn't have. Below me, they kept coming, a slow-motion invasion of translucent bodies flowing up the rock face like some nightmare tide that wouldn't stop until it reached me. I tried to make myself useful. Took photos, recorded observations on my waterproof recorder, documented everything I was seeing because if I was going to die here, at least the data should survive. I noted how they moved, how they seemed to be learning the terrain with each vertical foot they gained. How the first ones to try a particular route would fail, but the ones behind them would adjust and succeed. They were problem-solving in real time, adapting faster than any organism I had ever studied. The leading edge of the formation reached to within 10 feet of my ledge, and I could see the filaments extending toward me, taste something chemical in the air that might have been how they communicated. The Coast Guard helicopter found me at 7:30 p.m. They'd gotten a Mayday call from a fishing boat that had been caught in the storm and were doing a sweep of the coastline looking for others who might need rescue. They saw me through the rain, saw someone trapped on a rock face waving frantically, and dropped a rescue swimmer before I could explain what was really happening. The swimmer reached me, got the harness secured, and we lifted off into the storm with me screaming about organisms on the rocks, about something new to science, about needing to go back and collect samples. They took me to Forks Community Hospital and evaluated me for hypothermia and shock. Said I was lucky to be alive, that another hour on that exposed rock in that storm and I would have died from exposure. I tried to tell them about the organisms, about what I had seen, But the doctor nodded in that way medical professionals do when they think you're suffering from stress-induced hallucinations. They kept me overnight for observation, and when they released me the next morning, the storm had passed, the sun was out. I hired a private boat to take me back to Sinister Beach 2 days later. Hiked down to the tide pools with fresh equipment and a determination to prove what I'd seen. The pools were full of normal marine life. Sea stars, anemones, urchins, sculpin. No translucent organisms with impossible intelligence. No colonial entities that could survive on land. I checked every pool on that rocky shelf twice, documented everything, found absolutely no evidence that they'd ever existed. But I know what I saw. Know what climbed those rocks toward me with purpose and coordination that shouldn't exist in something without a complex nervous system. And sometimes I wonder if they're still there. If they just hid when I came back with witnesses and equipment. If they're down in the deeper water beyond the tide pools waiting for the next researcher who comes alone and gets curious about something they find in the pools. I wonder what they wanted from me. Whether they were trying to eliminate a threat or capture a specimen for their own study. I wonder if I was hunting them or if they were hunting me. And which of us learned more from the encounter. I got the fire lookout position on Mount Hood for the same reason most people take jobs like that. I needed to disappear for a while. 3 months alone in a tower 40 feet off the ground, watching for smoke during fire season, getting paid to sit in silence and think about all the ways my life in Portland had fallen apart. The job posting said minimal human contact, no cell service, supplies delivered every 2 weeks by helicopter. It sounded perfect. It sounded like exactly the kind of reset I needed after losing my job, my apartment, and my girlfriend in the span of 6 weeks. The tower itself was everything the recruitment photos had promised. A small room perched on metal legs, 12 feet square with windows on all 4 sides, giving me a 360-degree view of the Cascade Range. A bed, a desk, a propane stove, and a radio that connected me to the ranger station 20 miles away. The nearest hiking trail was 3 miles down a maintenance road that barely qualified as a road anymore. I'd seen maybe 5 other people in the 2 months since I'd started, all of them Forest Service workers checking equipment or doing surveys. It was isolation on a level I'd never experienced, and for the first few weeks, it was exactly what I needed. September rolled in cold and clear, the kind of weather that makes fire danger drop and lets everyone relax a little. I'd settled into a routine. Wake up at dawn, scan the forest for smoke, make coffee, read, scan again, make lunch, read some more, scan at sunset, sleep. It was monotonous in the best possible way. My replacement was scheduled to arrive in 2 weeks, and I'd already decided I was going to extend my contract into the winter monitoring season. The loneliness that had felt overwhelming in those first weeks had transformed into something peaceful, something I wasn't ready to give up. The radio call came on September 24th at 3:47 p.m. Dispatch asking me to confirm I was the only person assigned to Tower 7, asking if I'd seen any other Forest Service personnel in my area recently. I confirmed I was alone, hadn't seen anyone in over a week. There was a long pause before the dispatcher asked me to report anything unusual, any signs of people in the forest around my tower, and to maintain regular check-ins every 2 hours until further notice. When I asked what was going on, she said there had been an incident at one of the other towers, that a ranger had gone missing, and they were doing a precautionary sweep of all the remote stations. I spent the next 3 hours glassing the forest with my binoculars, looking for movement, for anything that seemed out of place. The trees stretched in every direction, a carpet of Douglas fir and hemlock broken only by the occasional clearing or rock formation. Nothing moved except wind through the branches, and a pair of ravens circling something dead, probably a mile to the west. I radioed in at 5:45 like I'd been instructed, reported no activity, and was told to maintain vigilance and lock my door after dark. The sun set at 7:23 p.m. I watched it sink behind the ridgeline and felt the temperature drop 10 degrees in as many minutes. I made dinner, rationing my supplies because the next helicopter drop wasn't scheduled for another 3 days, and settled in with a book and my propane lantern. The radio crackled occasionally with crosstalk between other stations. Rangers checking in, dispatch coordinating search efforts for whoever had gone missing. Nobody said what had actually happened, but the tension in their voices suggested it was serious. I heard the first footstep on the stairs at 11:34 p.m. Metal on metal, unmistakable even through the wind that had picked up after dark. Someone was climbing my tower. I turned off my lantern immediately and moved to the window that faced the stairs. The tower had 2 access points, a ladder that ran straight up the center of the support structure, and an external staircase that wrapped around the outside in a spiral. Both ended at a small platform outside my door. I couldn't see anyone on the platform, but I could hear breathing, heavy and wet, like someone who'd been running. I called out through the door, asked who was there, said I was armed, which was a lie, told them to identify themselves, or I'd radio for help. No response. Just that breathing and the creak of metal as weight shifted on the platform. I grabbed my radio and keyed the mic, started to report an intruder, but before I could speak, the door handle rattled. Someone was trying to open it. The door was locked, a simple deadbolt that came standard on all the fire towers, but it wasn't designed to keep out a determined person. It was meant to keep out bears and raccoons. The handle stopped rattling, and I heard footsteps descending the stairs. Slow, deliberate, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. I moved to the south window and caught a glimpse of something moving back into the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the base of the tower. Too dark to make out details. Just a shape that might have been human disappearing into the forest. I got on the radio immediately, reported the incident, described what I had seen. Dispatch told me to stay inside, keep my door locked, and that they'd have someone at my location by first light. The footsteps came back at 2:15 a.m. This time, they didn't stop at the door. I heard them continue up, climbing onto the roof of the tower, where there was nothing but a small maintenance platform surrounding the lightning rod. Weight creaking across the metal directly above my head, moving back and forth like someone was pacing. Then scratching, metal on metal, like someone was trying to pry up the roof panels or force their way through. I shone my flashlight at the ceiling and saw dust falling through gaps in the seams where the roof met the walls. I radioed again. Dispatch said the nearest ranger was still 2 hours out, that I needed to hold tight and keep reporting. I told them someone was on my roof trying to get in, that this wasn't just a hiker who'd gotten lost. This was someone actively trying to breach the tower. The dispatcher's voice got tight, professional in that way people sound when they're trying not to panic. She told me there had been 3 other towers hit in the past week, that rangers at 2 of them had been found dead, that the 3rd had disappeared completely. She said I needed to find a weapon, needed to prepare to defend myself, because help wasn't going to arrive in time. The roof access panel was in the northwest corner, a 2-foot square hatch that was padlocked from the inside for maintenance access. I heard the lock start to rattle, heard metal scraping against metal as something worked at it from above. The lock was solid, old Forest Service hardware that should have held. But after maybe 5 minutes of constant pressure, I heard it snap. The hatch lifted an inch, and I saw fingers, dirty and torn, gripping the edge. Then it slammed back down as whatever was up there repositioned for better leverage. I grabbed the only thing that could work as a weapon, a fire axe that was standard equipment in every tower for clearing brush. Positioned myself next to the hatch and waited. When it opened again, I swung, caught those fingers with the flat of the axe head, heard something that might have been a scream, but sounded more like wind through a cave. The hatch dropped shut and I heard scrambling on the roof, movement toward the edge, then the sound of something heavy hitting the stairs on the way down. I looked out the window and saw it clearly for the first time in the moonlight. It wasn't human. Had the general shape of a person, 2 arms and 2 legs, and something like a head. But the proportions were wrong, and the way it moved was wrong. And when it turned to look back at the tower, I saw eyes that reflected light like an animal's. It was naked, covered in dirt and what might have been dried blood, and it was missing most of its hair in patches that showed pale scalp underneath. But the worst part was its mouth, which hung open in a way that showed too many teeth, and the sound it made, which was my name, spoken in a voice that shouldn't have been able to form words. It came back up the stairs immediately, not cautiously this time, but fast, taking multiple steps at once, and I heard it hit the platform and throw itself against the door. The wood shuddered, the frame cracked, and I knew the lock wouldn't hold more than a few more impacts. I wedged the desk against the door and piled everything heavy I could find on top of it. My supplies, my books, the propane tank, anything that would add weight. The door shook with each impact, splinters appearing around the frame, and through the window I could see its face pressed against the glass, those wrong eyes staring at me, while its mouth worked at forming more words. It said my name again. Said other things too. Details about my life. It shouldn't have known. Names of people I'd left behind in Portland, secrets I'd never told anyone. The words came out distorted, like it was learning human speech by mimicking sounds it had heard. But the content was specific enough to be terrifying. It knew me, had somehow been watching me or accessing information about me or reading my thoughts in ways I couldn't understand. The door gave way at 4:52 a.m. The desk held for maybe 30 seconds before the sheer force of repeated impacts pushed it aside enough for the thing to squeeze through. I swung the axe as it came inside, caught it in the shoulder with the blade, felt the impact shudder up my arms. It didn't bleed. The wound opened and showed something underneath that wasn't muscle or bone, but something else. Something that moved on its own. And the smell that came out made me gag. It grabbed the axe handle and pulled, yanking it out of my hands with strength that shouldn't have been possible from something that weighed maybe 100 pounds. I went through the window. Didn't think about it. Just knew that staying inside meant dying. And I crashed through the glass and landed on the platform and started down the stairs. It came after me immediately, moving faster than me, taking impossible leaps that closed the distance between us. I made it maybe halfway down before it caught my ankle, pulled me off my feet, and I fell hard against the metal stairs. Pain exploded through my ribs, my vision went white, and I felt it climbing over me. Felt those wrong hands gripping my shoulders, felt its breath on my face smelling like rot and earth. The gunshot came from the tree line, then 3 more in rapid succession. The thing on top of me jerked with each impact, finally released its grip and tumbled off the side of the tower. I heard it hit the ground 40 feet below with a wet crunch. A voice called out, asking if I could move, and I looked down to see 2 rangers emerging from the forest, rifles raised, moving toward where the thing had fallen. They found me on the stairs 5 minutes later, helped me down to solid ground where I collapsed and couldn't stop shaking. They said they'd been tracking it for 3 days, following a pattern of attacks on remote towers, trying to figure out what it was and where it came from. They said they still didn't know what it was. The body had compound fractures and bullet wounds that should have been fatal, but it was still trying to move, still trying to crawl toward the tower. One of the rangers put another round through its head, and it finally stopped. They showed me photos the next day, after they'd airlifted me to the hospital in Hood River. Photos of what they'd found when they did the full forensic examination. The thing had been human once, maybe 6 months ago, before something changed it. They found a wallet in the remains of clothing it had been wearing. ID for a hiker who'd been reported missing in July, last seen heading into the Mount Hood wilderness alone. They said other bodies had been found in similar condition, all of them former hikers or campers who disappeared in the area over the past year. They said there might be more still out there in the forest, changed into something that hunted other people in the remote places where nobody could hear screaming. I didn't extend my contract. Didn't go back to the tower, even to collect my things. The Forest Service offered counseling and disability and an NDA that compensated me well enough that I didn't have to work for 6 months while I figured out what came next. They said the tower attacks had stopped after that night, that whatever had been changing people seemed to have burned itself out or moved on or been eliminated. They said I was safe, that I could go back to my normal life. But sometimes late at night, I still hear footsteps on stairs that don't exist. Still hear my name spoken in that wrong voice. Still smell that rot earth smell that came from the wound when I hit it with the axe. And I wonder how many other towers are out there in forests across the Pacific Northwest. How many other lookouts are sitting alone in the darkness right now, listening for sounds that don't belong and hoping that whatever climbs their stairs is human enough to reason with. I'd been researching the 1924 Ape Canyon incident for my documentary series on Pacific Northwest cryptids for 8 months, before I finally got permission to hike into the actual location. The story was famous in Bigfoot circles. 5 miners working a claim on the east side of Mount St. Helens reported being attacked by a group of large, ape-like creatures that threw rocks at their cabin all night and tried to break down the door. One miner claimed he'd shot one of the creatures earlier that day and watched it fall into a canyon, which is how the place got its name. Most people dismissed it as frontier tall tales or misidentified bears. But I'd found inconsistencies in the debunking that made me think there was something worth investigating. The Forest Service ranger who issued my permit was blunt about the risks. The area around Ape Canyon was remote, the terrain was difficult, and I'd be hiking alone into country where people occasionally disappeared. He said they got maybe 3 search and rescue calls a year from that region, usually hikers who got turned around in the old growth forest or injured on the volcanic rock formations. He also said, off the record, that the Cowlitz tribe considered the entire area sacred and dangerous, that their elders told stories about giants that lived in caves on the mountain and didn't like being disturbed. I thanked him for the warning and promised to be careful. The hike in took me 6 hours through forest so dense that even at noon the light was filtered and green. The 1924 cabin site was long gone, reclaimed by vegetation and time. But I'd done enough research to pinpoint the approximate location based on old mining claim maps and geological surveys. I found it in a small clearing where the trees thinned out near a ridge that dropped sharply into the canyon below. There were still remnants if you knew where to look. Foundation stones barely visible under moss and ferns, rusted pieces of equipment half buried in decades of forest debris. And most significantly, a cave entrance about 30 yards from where the cabin had stood. The cave wasn't mentioned in any of the historical accounts I'd read, which seemed like a massive oversight. If the creatures in the 1924 story were real, if they were some kind of undiscovered primate species, then they had to be living somewhere nearby. Caves made perfect sense. I approached the entrance carefully, documenting everything with my camera. noting the size of the opening, which was maybe 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide. Large enough for a human to walk through upright, but not so large that it would be obvious from a distance. The opening faced away from the canyon, hidden in a rock formation that would be invisible unless you were standing exactly where I was. I should have waited until morning to explore it, should have set up camp, gotten a good night's sleep, and approached the cave in full daylight with proper backup plans in place. But I'd hiked 6 hours to get here, and I had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. And the cave was right there, possibly containing evidence of the most significant cryptozoological discovery in North American history. I turned on my headlamp, checked that my backup flashlight was accessible, and stepped inside. The cave went back farther than my light could reach, angling downward into the mountain at a gentle slope that made walking easy. The walls were volcanic rock, smooth in places where ancient lava flows had created natural tunnels, rough in others where more recent geological activity had caused collapses and reformations. The air was cold and smelled like earth and something else, something organic that I couldn't quite identify. I followed the main passage for maybe 200 feet, documenting everything, collecting samples of what looked like hair caught on rough stone, taking measurements of the tunnel dimensions. That's when I found the first bones. They were piled in a side chamber maybe 10 feet off the main passage, stacked with a deliberation that couldn't be natural. Deer, mostly, based on the skulls and the size of the long bones, but also smaller animals. Raccoons, possums, maybe a cougar based on one skull that had the distinctive shortened face and large canines. And mixed in with the animal bones were pieces that made my hands shake as I photographed them. A human femur, a pelvis that was definitely human based on the structure, a skull that had been cracked open, the interior completely empty like something had been extracted. I documented everything with methodical precision, forcing myself into researcher mode, refusing to acknowledge the fear that was building in my chest. These bones were old. Decades old, probably. Could have been here since the 1920s or earlier. Could have been miners who disappeared in this remote area and whose deaths had been attributed to accidents or bears. Could have been Cowlitz people from even earlier, before European contact, back when the tribes avoided this mountain because they knew what lived here. I took samples, marked GPS coordinates, made detailed notes about everything I was seeing. The passage continued deeper into the mountain. I should have turned back, should have taken my evidence and hiked out while I still had daylight. But I kept going. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber maybe 50 feet across with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above my headlamp's range. The floor was covered in more bones, more evidence of habitation. And along one wall, I saw what looked like nesting material. Branches and moss and ferns arranged into 3 large circular depressions, each one maybe 6 feet in diameter, sized for something considerably larger than a human. I was taking photographs of the nests when I heard the sound from deeper in the cave. Not wind, not water, but breathing. Deep, rhythmic, the kind of breathing that comes from lungs with serious capacity. And it was getting closer. I turned off my headlamp immediately, stood perfectly still in the darkness, and listened. Multiple sources of breathing now, at least 3, maybe more, echoing through the chamber in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint exact locations. And then a smell hit me, overwhelming in its intensity, a mixture of animal musk and rotting meat and something else that made my hindbrain scream danger. I turned my headlamp back on and saw them. 3 of them standing at the far end of the chamber, where another tunnel must have led deeper into the cave system. They were massive, 7 feet tall at minimum, covered in dark hair, and built with a musculature that made them look like anatomy textbook illustrations of what humans would be if we'd evolved for pure physical power. Their faces were a horrifying blend of human and ape. Flat noses, heavy brow ridges, eyes that caught my light and reflected it back in a way that confirmed they had the same light-gathering adaptations as nocturnal predators. And they were staring at me with an intelligence that was unmistakable and absolutely terrifying. I ran, didn't think about documentation or evidence or scientific protocol, just turned and ran back toward the entrance with my headlamp bouncing wildly off the tunnel walls. Behind me, I heard them coming. Heard the sound of massive bodies moving through the passage with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something that large. They knew this cave perfectly, could navigate in complete darkness, and I was an intruder in their home being hunted by creatures that had been hunting in these mountains for potentially thousands of years. I made it to the entrance and burst out into twilight that was rapidly fading into darkness. The forest that had seemed peaceful 6 hours ago now looked like hostile territory, with 1,000 places for something to hide. I ran toward where I'd planned to set up camp, where my pack was waiting with supplies and emergency equipment. But I could hear them emerging from the cave behind me, could hear the sound of breaking branches as they moved through the forest in pursuit. I didn't make it to my pack. One of them came at me from the side, moving through the trees with a silence that shouldn't have been possible for something weighing probably 400 pounds. It hit me at full speed and I went down hard, felt ribs crack from the impact, tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue. It pinned me to the ground with one hand, just one hand holding my chest down while I struggled uselessly, and I got a close look at its face. The eyes were brown and deep and showed an awareness that was utterly human in the worst possible way. This wasn't an animal. This was something else. Something that understood exactly what it was doing. The others arrived within seconds, circling my position, making sounds that might have been communication or might have been something else. One of them picked up a rock the size of my head, and I thought that was it. That I was about to have my skull crushed the same way that skull in the bone pile had been crushed decades ago. But instead, it threw the rock away from me, into the forest, and they all watched to see if I'd react. They were testing me, playing with me, demonstrating their dominance over an intruder who'd violated their territory. They kept me pinned there for maybe 20 minutes, taking turns holding me down while the others moved around examining my pack, my camera equipment, everything I'd brought. One of them found my camera and I watched as it turned the device over in its hands, manipulating the controls with fingers that were thick but surprisingly dexterous. It looked at the screen where my most recent photos were displayed, looked at images of its nest, its bone pile, its cave. Then it looked at me and made a sound that was definitely anger, definitely a threat, and definitely understood that I'd been documenting their home. It smashed the camera against a rock and threw the pieces at me. Then it picked me up, lifted me off the ground with terrifying ease, and threw me toward the direction of the trail out. I hit the ground and rolled maybe 10 feet. And when I looked back, they were all three standing there at the edge of the clearing, backlit by the last light of sunset, watching to make sure I understood the message. Leave. Don't come back. Tell no one, or next time they wouldn't let me go. I hiked out in complete darkness, using my backup flashlight, moving as fast as my injured ribs would allow. It took me 9 hours to reach my car, and I drove straight to the ranger station in Cougar, even though it was 3:00 a.m. I told them I'd been attacked by bears, that I needed medical attention, that my equipment had been destroyed. They took me to the hospital where x-rays confirmed 3 cracked ribs and a minor concussion. They asked if I wanted to file a report about the bears, and I said no. That I'd been stupid to hike alone, and I'd learned my lesson. I never went back to Ape Canyon. Never published my documentary about the 1924 incident. The samples I'd collected, the hair and the GPS coordinates of the bone pile. All of it went into a storage unit where it stayed for the past 3 years. Because I understand now what the miners in 1924 understood, what the Cowlitz elders have always known. There are things living in the remote places of the Pacific Northwest that predate human civilization in this region. Things that have learned to avoid us mostly, but will defend their territory with extreme prejudice when we get too close. The 1924 attack happened because those miners found the cave, just like I did. They saw things they weren't supposed to see, documented a presence that wanted to stay hidden. The creatures drove them off the mountain, and the miners told their story. But nobody believed them because the alternative was too frightening. The alternative was admitting that we're not alone in these forests, that we're not the apex predator, that there are places we shouldn't go and boundaries we shouldn't cross. I think about those creatures sometimes, about the intelligence I saw in their eyes, about how they chose to let me live. And I wonder how many other people have had encounters like mine. How many other hikers and researchers have stumbled onto something in the deep wilderness that sent them running back to civilization with stories nobody would believe. I wonder how many of them stayed silent like me, too afraid of what would happen if they spoke up, too aware that the creatures showed mercy once but might not show it again. And I wonder what will happen when development finally reaches into those remote areas. When we push too far into territory that was never meant to be ours. When we finally cross a line that makes those creatures decide that coexistence is no longer possible. The rain started on October 3rd, and it never stopped. Not in the way Pacific Northwest rain usually stops, giving you a day or two of cloud break before the next system rolls in from the ocean. This was continuous, relentless. The kind of rain that falls so steadily you stop hearing it as individual drops and start hearing it as white noise that fills every silence. By the second week, people in Manzanita were joking about building an ark. By the fourth week, nobody was joking anymore. I'd lived on the Oregon coast my entire life, was used to the winter storms that bring 20 inches of rain in a month, the atmospheric rivers that flood roads and knock out power for days at a time. But this was different. The Weather Service kept issuing forecasts that showed the rain ending, systems moving through and clearing out. But it never happened. The radar would show breaks coming, and then at the last minute, another band of moisture would appear, and the rain would continue. By week 6, we'd received over 90 inches of precipitation, 3 times our normal November total. And the meteorologists were starting to sound confused in their daily briefings. The town changed gradually enough that you didn't notice it at first. Small things. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the coffee shop, stopped opening on time, then stopped opening some days entirely. When you did see her, she looked exhausted, talked about how the sound of rain on her roof was keeping her awake, how she couldn't remember what silence felt like anymore. The high school canceled classes for 3 days because half the students weren't showing up. And when they reopened, the kids who did come sat in classrooms staring out windows at rain that never varied in intensity, never gave them anything different to look at. I worked at the library, had for 15 years, and I watched our patron behavior shift week by week. People stopped checking out cheerful books, stopped asking for recommendations for light reading. They wanted dark stuff, horror and true crime and apocalyptic fiction, like they needed to read about situations worse than their own. Or they wanted nothing at all, would just sit at the table staring at nothing, listening to rain hammer the roof. We had to install buckets in 3 corners where leaks had developed. and the constant drip, drip, drip became another layer of sound that nobody acknowledged, but everyone heard. By week 8, the mold started appearing. Everyone's house had it. Black spots spreading across ceilings and walls faster than you could clean it. The air smelled perpetually damp, that musty odor of wet fabric and rotting wood that no amount of ventilation could eliminate. My clothes never felt fully dry, even straight from the dryer. My skin was constantly clammy. I developed a cough that wouldn't go away, and when I went to the clinic, Dr. Hassan said half the town had the same thing. That prolonged exposure to damp conditions was causing respiratory issues across the board. The isolation got worse as roads started failing. Highway 101 washed out north of town in 3 places, cutting us off from Tillamook. The south route toward Cannon Beach developed a massive sinkhole that swallowed a delivery truck and closed that direction for weeks. We were effectively trapped. A town of 800 people surrounded by flooded forest with rain that never stopped, and no clear timeline for when things would return to normal. The grocery store started rationing supplies. The gas station put limits on fuel. People began hoarding, began treating every resource like it might be the last one available. I noticed my neighbors changing around week 10. The Johnsons next door stopped maintaining their yard, let the grass grow into a jungle, and the gutters overflow until water poured down their siding in constant sheets. I saw Tom Johnson standing in his driveway one morning just staring up at the sky with rain pouring down his face. And when I asked if he was okay, he didn't seem to hear me. His wife Linda had stopped going to work at the tourist center, which had closed anyway since no tourists could get into town. Their daughter Emma, who was 12, had started spending hours sitting on their covered porch watching the rain. And I heard her counting drops one afternoon, keeping a steady tally in a whisper that went on for over an hour. The town meeting in week 12 was when I realized how bad things had gotten. Maybe 200 people showed up, which was a quarter of the population, and everyone looked sick, pale, hollow-eyed, moving with a lethargy that spoke of deep exhaustion. Mayor Davidson tried to give updates on road repairs and supply deliveries, but people kept interrupting with questions that didn't make sense. Someone asked when the rain had started, seemed genuinely unable to remember that it had only been 3 months, insisted it felt like years. Someone else asked if anyone else could hear the rain talking, if the pattern of drops on their roof was forming words. Mayor Davidson suggested people seek mental health support, and someone laughed, a high, brittle sound that went on too long. That night, I stood in my living room, listening to rain on my roof, and tried to remember what dry days felt like. Tried to recall the sensation of walking outside without immediately getting wet, of seeing blue sky, of feeling warmth from sun on my skin. The memories were there but distant, like they belonged to a different person in a different life. I realized I'd stopped checking weather forecasts a week ago because they never showed anything changing. Rain today, rain tomorrow, rain extending as far as the models could predict. The Pacific Northwest was known for rain, but this had crossed some threshold from normal weather pattern into something else. Week 14 brought the first disappearance. Marcus Chen, who taught biology at the high school, went out for a walk and didn't come back. His wife called it in after 6 hours, and the county sheriff organized a search party. But the rain made tracking impossible, and the forest was so saturated that new streams had formed everywhere, turning familiar terrain into a maze of running water. They found his car at the trailhead for Niakani Mountain, found his phone and wallet locked inside, but no sign of Marcus. The search continued for 3 days before they gave up. His wife Sarah sat in the library every day after that, reading the same book over and over, turning pages without seeming to see the words. I started noticing changes in myself around that time. difficulty concentrating, thoughts that would start and then drift away before reaching any conclusion. I'd forget why I'd walked into rooms, forget conversations I'd had hours earlier. My sleep was fractured, broken into segments by dreams of drowning, of water rising through my house while I tried to bail it out with my hands. I'd wake up convinced I could hear water running somewhere in the walls, that would spend an hour trying to locate a leak that didn't exist. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked wrong. Eyes darker than I remembered. Skin with a grayish tint that might have been the lighting or might have been something else. The second and third disappearances happened in week 16. Both times it was people who'd lived here for decades, who knew the area as well as anyone could. Both times they just walked away from their homes and vanished into forest that was more water than land at this point. The search parties found nothing. No bodies, no evidence of what had happened to them. People started speculating that they'd left town somehow, had hiked out cross-country to escape Manzanita and the rain. But that made no sense. The rain was everywhere. Weather reports showed the same system covering the entire Pacific Northwest, from Northern California to British Columbia. There was nowhere to escape to. Week 17 was when I saw the changes in the landscape. Walking to work one morning through rain that was now mixed with fog so thick I could barely see 20 feet. I noticed the trees looked different. Darker, the bark glistening not just with water, but with something else. A sheen that looked almost oily. Moss had grown with impossible speed, covering trunks in thick carpets of green and covering ground that should have been too exposed to support such growth. And the mushrooms were everywhere, huge clusters of them sprouting from every surface, colors that seemed too bright in the perpetual gray light. I reached out to touch one, and my hand came away with a residue that smelled like earth and rot and something faintly chemical. The town meeting in week 18 dissolved into chaos. People were openly crying, others were angry, demanding that someone do something about the rain like we had control over the weather. A man I didn't recognize stood up and started screaming that we'd angered something, that the rain was punishment for disturbing land that should have been left alone. Security removed him, but his words hung in the air after he left. And I saw people nodding in agreement. Mayor Davidson announced that we were in contact with state emergency services, that supplies would be helicoptered in, that roads would be repaired as soon as conditions permitted. Nobody believed him. You could see it in their faces, the resignation, the acceptance that this was permanent. I started losing time around week 20. Would realize I'd been staring at nothing for hours, that entire afternoons had passed without me noticing. The library was nearly empty now. Maybe 5 or 6 people coming in on a good day, all of them exhibiting the same lethargy I felt. Sarah Chen was still there daily, still reading her same book. And one afternoon I realized the book was upside down and she hadn't noticed. I tried to tell her, and she looked at me with eyes that didn't seem to register what I was saying, then went back to turning pages that she couldn't possibly be reading. The Johnsons next door stopped answering their door around week 22. I could see lights on inside their house at night, could see shadows moving past windows. But when I knocked to check on them, there was no response. I called the sheriff, but they said unless I had evidence of an emergency, they were too understaffed to do wellness checks. Half the department had stopped showing up for work. People were just staying home, sitting in their damp houses, listening to rain that never ended, waiting for something to change that was never going to change. I found the body in week 24. Walking home from the library through rain that had somehow intensified, rain that felt heavier than water should feel, I saw something in the drainage ditch beside the road. It was Marcus Chen, or what was left of him. He'd been in the water for 10 weeks, but he looked wrong. His skin had a greenish tint and there was moss growing on him. Actual moss, like he'd been lying there for years instead of months. And he was smiling, his face frozen in an expression of peaceful contentment that made me stumble backward and nearly fall. I reported it, and they came and took him away. But I couldn't shake the image of that smile. Like he'd found something in the rain that the rest of us were still searching for. Week 26. The power went out permanently. The utility workers said the equipment couldn't handle the constant moisture anymore, that systems designed for Pacific Northwest rain weren't designed for this, for rain that never stopped long enough for anything to dry. We were on generators and candles and flashlights, with batteries that were running low. The grocery store closed because their refrigeration failed and everything spoiled. We were eating canned goods and whatever dried goods people had stockpiled. And there was talk of rationing, of supplies running out before help could reach us. I'm writing this by candlelight on day 197. The rain is still falling. I can't remember what my face looked like before, when my skin was dry and my eyes were clear. I can't remember what silence sounds like without the constant background noise of water hitting roof and ground and windows. Sometimes I stand outside and let it soak me completely, and I swear I can feel myself changing. Feel something in the rain seeping through my skin into my bones, reprogramming me at a cellular level to accept this as normal. Most of the town is gone now. Not dead, just gone. Houses standing empty with doors hanging open and rain pouring inside. I don't know where people went. Maybe they walked into the forest like Marcus did. Maybe they're still out there, wandering through trees that have grown strange and dark, becoming part of whatever this place is turning into. The rain doesn't feel like water anymore. It feels like something alive, something with intention. And I think it's changing us into something that belongs here in this new world it's creating. I should leave. Should try to hike out, find somewhere the rain has stopped, prove that this is just localized, just Manzanita and not the entire world. But when I think about leaving, I feel panic, feel the same wrongness I'd feel about cutting off a limb. The rain is part of me now. I'm part of it. And sometimes late at night when I'm half asleep, I understand that it was never rain at all. It's something older, something that existed before humans came to this coast. And it's finally reclaiming what was always its own. The drops on my window are forming patterns. If I stare long enough, they start to look like words. I think they're telling me to come outside, to stop resisting, to accept what I'm becoming. And the terrible thing is, I want to. I'm so tired of fighting, so tired of remembering what dry felt like. It would be easier to just open the door and walk out into the rain and let it finish whatever transformation it started 6 months ago. Emma Johnson is standing in my yard right now. I can see her through the window, standing perfectly still with rain pouring over her. And she's smiling the same smile Marcus had. She's been out there for 3 hours, and she hasn't moved, and I think she's waiting for me. I think they're all waiting, everyone who's disappeared, standing in the rain and smiling, and becoming something new. Something that belongs here. Something the rain made. I'm going outside now. The rain is calling. And I'm so tired of being the only one left who's still trying to stay human. If anyone finds this, if the rain ever stops and people come back to Manzanita and find it empty, I want you to know that we didn't die. We just changed. We became part of the water that falls forever, part of the Pacific Northwest that drowns everything eventually. And it's not as terrible as you'd think. The rain knows what it's doing. The rain has always known. I went to Hanford because I didn't believe the government's story about what they'd buried there. 50 years of plutonium production for nuclear weapons, they said. The most contaminated site in the Western Hemisphere, they said. Cleanup would take another 50 years, they said. But the reports I'd found buried in declassified documents and leaked internal memos suggested they were hiding something bigger than nuclear waste. Something that made radiation look manageable by comparison. Getting past the security wasn't as hard as you'd think for a 580-square-mile restricted area. They couldn't fence all of it, couldn't monitor every access point along the Columbia River or through the desert scrubland that surrounded the site. I came in from the north at 2 a.m. on a moonless October night, carrying minimal gear and a Geiger counter I'd modified to be silent so the clicking wouldn't give me away. My plan was simple. Get to the central waste storage area, document whatever they were hiding in the underground tanks, and get out before sunrise when the security patrols intensified. The landscape was alien, even in darkness. Nothing but sagebrush and dry grass stretching in every direction, broken occasionally by the massive concrete shells of decommissioned reactors that loomed like monuments to Cold War paranoia. The Geiger counter stayed relatively quiet as I moved deeper into the restricted zone. Just background radiation slightly elevated above normal. Nothing immediately dangerous. Nothing that explained why this entire area had been off limits to the public since 1943, when they evacuated entire towns to build the Manhattan Project facilities here. I reached the B reactor complex at 3:47 a.m. The first full-scale plutonium production reactor ever built. Now a National Historic Landmark that nobody was allowed to visit without extensive security clearance and hazmat protocols. The building was massive. A windowless concrete block 4 stories tall with warning signs posted every 10 feet about radiation danger and unauthorized access being a federal crime. I photographed everything, documenting the exterior conditions, noting areas where the concrete had cracked and vegetation was growing through, signs that maybe the containment wasn't as secure as the government claimed. That's when I saw the first light. Not from the building, but above it. A blue-white glow maybe 1,000 feet up, moving in a pattern that wasn't consistent with aircraft or satellites or anything I could immediately identify. I watched it for maybe 3 minutes as it performed maneuvers that would have killed any human pilot. Right-angle turns at what looked like incredible speed. Sudden stops that violated every law of physics I understood. The Pacific Northwest had more UFO sightings per capita than anywhere else in the country. And Hanford specifically had been the subject of reports since the 1940s. Reports that the government had always dismissed as misidentified aircraft or weather phenomena. The light descended, not gradually, but in a controlled drop that brought it from 1,000 feet to maybe 300 in under 5 seconds. It hovered there above the reactor, pulsing slowly, and I could see it was attached to something larger. A structure that was dark except for those lights, massive from what I could make out against the stars and completely silent. No engine noise, no propulsion system I could identify. Just this vast presence hanging in the air above a nuclear facility in the middle of the night where nobody should have been watching. I took photos. Rapid-fire documentation with my camera set to silent mode, capturing everything I could see of the object and the lights and the way they illuminated the reactor below. This was it. This was what they'd been hiding, what all the security and restrictions and decades of cleanup delays were really about. Hanford wasn't just a nuclear waste site. It was something else. Something that attracted or contained or maybe even housed whatever these things were that violated our understanding of physics and technology. The object moved toward me, not fast but deliberately, like it had noticed my presence and was coming to investigate. The lights intensified as it approached, changed from blue-white to something that hurt to look at directly. a color that seemed to exist outside the normal spectrum. My Geiger counter started clicking, slowly at first, then faster, then in a continuous rattle that meant I was being exposed to radiation levels that were immediately dangerous. The object was maybe 200 feet away now, and I could see details. Surfaces that looked organic and mechanical simultaneously, geometries that didn't make sense, proportions that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. I ran, turned and sprinted back the way I'd come, back toward the perimeter and the river and anything that wasn't this thing that was pursuing me across contaminated ground. The light stayed with me, matching my pace exactly, sometimes ahead of me and sometimes behind, like it was toying with me or studying my behavior. The Geiger counter never stopped rattling. I was accumulating a radiation dose with every second I stayed in this area, cellular damage that would show up as cancer or organ failure or genetic mutations if I survived long enough to manifest symptoms. I made it maybe 2 miles before I collapsed. Not from radiation sickness yet, that took hours to develop, but from pure exhaustion and the realization that I couldn't outrun something that could move at impossible speeds and seemed to be deliberately keeping pace with me. I lay there in the dirt, gasping for air while the object hovered maybe 50 feet above, lights pulsing in a rhythm that felt almost like communication, trying to tell me something or ask me something or just acknowledge that I was there. The ground started vibrating, a deep subsonic rumble that I felt through my entire body. And when I looked around, I saw I wasn't near the reactor anymore. I'd run past it somehow, gotten turned around in the darkness, and ended up near one of the underground waste storage areas. Massive tanks buried 50 feet below the surface, each one holding thousands of gallons of high-level radioactive waste that would remain deadly for thousands of years. And something was happening to them. The ground above the tanks was bulging upward, soil and rocks being pushed aside by pressure from below. The lights from the object intensified and swept across the disturbed ground, illuminating what was rising from the waste tanks. It wasn't liquid, and it wasn't solid, but something in between that moved with purpose and intelligence. It looked like it was made of the same material as the object hovering above, that same organic mechanical geometry that hurt to perceive. And it was growing, spreading outward from the tanks in tendrils that reached for the surface, for the open air, for freedom from whatever containment had held it underground for decades. I understood then what Hanford really was. Not just a nuclear production site, not just a waste storage facility, but a containment zone. During the Manhattan Project, they'd found something here, something that predated human civilization, something that existed in a state that made it compatible with radioactive materials in ways that normal matter wasn't. They'd built the reactors not just to produce plutonium, but to study it, to understand what it was and how it worked, and whether it could be weaponized or controlled. And when production ended, they'd buried it in waste tanks, used the radiation to keep it dormant, and classified the entire operation at levels that meant nobody would ever know what they were really dealing with. The object above me descended further, came to rest on the ground maybe 20 feet from where I lay, and something emerged from it. Not a door opening or a ramp extending, but a section of the surface simply becoming permeable and allowing passage. What came through was roughly humanoid in the way that a stick figure is humanoid. The basic structure of 2 arms and 2 legs and a head, but proportions and articulation that were completely wrong. It moved toward me across ground that was now glowing faintly with contamination. And behind it, I could see more of them emerging from the object, moving toward the waste tanks where that other thing was still trying to break free. They weren't hostile. That's what made it worse somehow. The realization that they weren't attacking or threatening, but just doing a job. Containing the breach, securing whatever had been trying to escape, maintaining a quarantine that humans had accidentally created when we buried alien entities in radioactive waste without understanding what we were doing. They moved around me like I wasn't there, or like I was so insignificant that I didn't warrant attention. Just another contaminated organism in an area full of contamination. I crawled away. Slow progress through dirt that was now visibly glowing in places where contamination had reached the surface, where the decades of leaking tanks and incomplete cleanup had created pockets of radioactivity that would kill me if I stayed too long. My Geiger counter had stopped working, maybe burned out from overexposure, or maybe disabled by whatever those things emitted. I had no way to know how much radiation I'd absorbed, no way to calculate whether I had hours or days, or maybe just minutes before my cells started failing systematically. Behind me, I heard sounds that weren't mechanical and weren't organic, but somehow both. The things from the object were fighting or negotiating or communicating with whatever had been trying to escape the waste tanks. And the air smelled like ozone and burning metal, and something else that made my skin prickle with wrongness. The lights were everywhere now, dozens of them, more objects arriving and surrounding the breach area. And I realized I was witnessing something that probably happened regularly. Periodic maintenance visits to ensure containment, to prevent whatever we'd accidentally imprisoned from breaking free and spreading beyond Hanford's restricted boundaries. I reached the river at dawn, the Columbia River that bordered the site for 51 miles. Water that was supposedly monitored and treated and kept safe, despite flowing through the most contaminated area in the hemisphere. I collapsed at the shore and tried to decide whether drinking the water would make things worse or whether I was already so contaminated that a little more wouldn't matter. Behind me, the lights were fading as the objects departed, their work completed, the breach contained for another day or month or year until it tried again. A security patrol found me at 7:23 a.m. 2 men in hazmat suits who scanned me with equipment that made them exchange worried looks before loading me into a vehicle and driving to a medical facility I'd never heard of. They didn't ask questions, and they didn't answer mine. Just processed me through decontamination protocols and drew blood samples and took readings with instruments I didn't recognize. A woman in a suit without insignia or identification told me I'd been exposed to radiation levels that required immediate treatment, that I'd be staying under observation for an indefinite period, that my camera and all my equipment had been confiscated for disposal. I asked her what was really buried at Hanford, what was in those waste tanks that required visitors from somewhere else to maintain containment. She looked at me with eyes that were completely neutral and said that Hanford contained exactly what the public record indicated: nuclear waste from Cold War weapons production, nothing more. Then she asked if I understood that discussing classified information, even information I believed I'd observed, constituted a federal crime with severe penalties. I said I understood. She said good, and that I'd be released once medical staff determined I was stable enough to survive outside treatment. They kept me for 6 weeks, treated my radiation exposure with medications that had side effects worse than the radiation itself, monitored my blood counts as they dropped and slowly recovered, and made sure I understood through repeated visits from that woman in the suit that silence was not optional. They offered compensation, a substantial amount of money in exchange for signing documents that acknowledged I'd trespassed on federal property and agreed never to discuss what I'd seen or experienced. I signed. What choice did I have? Who would believe me anyway? But I think about it every day. About what we buried at Hanford without understanding what it was, about how we accidentally created a prison using radioactivity as bars, about things from elsewhere that visit regularly to maintain containment we don't even know we need. I think about all the other nuclear sites around the world, all the other places where we've buried waste and classified what we found and convinced ourselves we're just dealing with radiation, when maybe we're dealing with something far worse. And sometimes, late at night, I see lights moving across the sky in patterns that aircraft don't follow. And I wonder if they're watching other sites. If Hanford is just one containment zone among many. If our nuclear age accidentally overlapped with something older and stranger, and we've spent 70 years pretending it's just plutonium in those tanks. The radiation will probably kill me eventually. The doctors said my long-term prognosis wasn't good, that I should expect complications, that I'd been exposed to enough contamination to significantly shorten my lifespan. But at least I know why. At least I understand that some secrets stay buried not because the government wants to hide them, but because the alternative, admitting what's really out there, sharing our planet and watching our nuclear facilities, would break something fundamental in how we understand our place in the universe. If you made it to the end of these 11 Pacific Northwest horror stories, you've journeyed through fog that traps travelers, forests that learn your voice, depths that hold ancient things, and government secrets that guard cosmic horrors. These are the stories that remind us the Pacific Northwest isn't just beautiful. It's dangerous in ways that maps and warnings can never fully communicate. If these tales left you unsettled, if they made you look at the forests and coastlines differently, then subscribe to Verified Fears for more horror content that explores the dark corners of America where fear lives and thrives. Hit that notification bell because the next collection of nightmares is already waiting. And trust me, you won't want to face them alone. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember that not everything in the mist wants to be found.